It's Tim. Hey, Tim. How are you?
I think you think stray hairs in there, but you might want to check. Thank you so much.
Fine. You can keep it if you want.
Hello, Tim.
Keep it.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Oh,
Hi, Karen. How are you going?
How are you? You look
That's
very
lovely.
different.
Very
You don't have
handy
glasses
bag
on. That's what it is.
I can't.
And you've got
The screen's better without glasses. So I put the glasses on, it's blurry, the screen. So I've got to get to the optometrist to get a new script.
You do, you do. All right, so I am just going to let people in the waiting room. Kaz, Alina Gaboron, Brenda, Logan, and Julie, somebody, and David Carmichael. How truly wonderful.
Do you have a background in this area?
Hello?
What did you do at uni?
Ricky, don't be a dick. Hello? Hello.
Hello there.
Hello to people. Does everyone have your audio on? Yes, people have their audio on. Brenda? Brenda, you're on mute.
Hi.
Julie having some toast for Becky. Or for dinner. Who knows? Depends where you are, really, doesn't it?
It's midnight.
Midnight toast. Yeah, you.
Yeah.
Oh, David Carmichael, I'm so happy you made
Hello.
it.
Well, it's a pleasure to join all of you again.
Oh, look, there's only a very few of us. There were going to be multitudes, but hey, that did not happen. I'm so glad.
Well, we'll have a good discussion.
We will have a good chat. All right. So now I'm just going to try and work out a way so that this isn't just me who can see the screen. So give me a few minutes, and Kaz, you're still on mute. Right. Okay, connecting to audio. All right. Hold on a second. Oh shit. Oh, I'm so glad. Oh, sorry. That was just me swearing as usual. Just knocked something over. All right. So I think the best way that I can do this is to be at a distance. Yeah, to be at a distance. And
no, take the bowl too.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. What's going on? Okay. So, Kaz, you're still on.
Yes, hello.
Oh, hello. How are you?
Good, how are you? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Yes. Are you Kaz Ann?
Yes, that's me.
Oh, okay. Welcome to the world.
Thank you.
So I think that's going to be it for the time being. There are some other people who are coming in later throughout the day, and I will do my best to make this as organised as I possibly can, really. But it's also that thing of designing this for people to have conversations and to ask questions. So even though there's a running schedule, which have set times, the idea, if it's fine with the people who are actually speaking, including people who are here, Megan and Katie and Lindy, that this is an interactive sort of session, if that's okay with people.
Fabulous.
Yeah. All right. So we will start just with a welcome to country, if that's okay with. If that's okay with you.
That's fine.
So this is Maggie Hall, and there you go.
Joining Karen on the official floor.
On the floor.
Hi everyone, my name is Maggie Hall. Happy to meet you all today. I'm not here in my official capacity, but I want to introduce myself. I'm a lecturer at Western Sydney Uni, background in criminal law and social work and lots of other things. Very interested in this topic, so I was really happy to come along today and join in. But I wanted to firstly welcome you all to country, or acknowledge the country that we're on. I can't welcome you because I'm not Indigenous, but I acknowledge that we're on the land of the Darkinjung people. This land was never ceded, and I wanted to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So welcome you all here today, and I'll hand back over to Karen.
Thanks, Matt. And it is that truly lovely thing of what we've seen in Australia come into being, you know, and that's acknowledgement to country, really, and it's a beautiful thing to have happen in our lifetime. And a lot of this that we're speaking about today is coming from that perspective of change making and what change can come about, what change we can at least attempt to initiate in the topics that we're looking at today, which is originated with creativity and mental health and the role of the arts. But it's this second part is truth-telling and consequences, and it's what happens in the mental health system to people who speak out against the mental health system, such as myself. And it's also that thing of attempting to bring recognition of the importance of listening to people's stories into this whole arena, rather than just coming from a perspective of listening to symptoms, really, and providing a diagnosis and medications that are going to address those symptoms. So it's the difference between what happens to you and what's wrong with you, and that's a change that's come into the mental health dialogue, I guess, mental health system dialogue, and that's one of the good things. But certainly from what I've seen, it sure as hell is not practiced. It's good in theory, but lots of people still end up with diagnoses and misdiagnoses and medicated to the gills, etc. And this is an attempt to bring in other perspectives so that doesn't happen as often, really, or at all would be good, but hey. So that being said, I'm going to hand over to Lindy Mitchell-Nielsen, and I don't know how well this will translate on the small screen, because this is a storytelling piece that is very beautiful and germane to what we're talking about today. So Lindy.
Thank you, Karen. Nice to be here. Hello, everybody. I only know Karen, I think, out there, but lovely all to see you. Yeah, Karen and I just met on Facebook, actually, and she asked me to come and tell a story, so here I am. So this happened a few years ago. I'd just written my first children's book, and it was about a little elf. And somehow, and I really can't remember how, but a radio program in America had learnt that I had talked to the fairies, and the program was called Spiritually Raw. And so they rang me up and asked me to come and talk about my experiences on their radio show. Well, I don't know how they got me there, but the radio show was at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I woke up and I was very nervous, thinking, oh my God, I've got to be charming and witty at 2 a.m. in the morning, not my finest hour. Anyway, the show went surprisingly well, and they seemed to be really on board with my talks with the fairies and how it unfolded, and it went so well, they said, would you come back on Friday for our panel show? And I thought, oh, that's lovely. I'd love to come back and talk about the fairies on your panel show. And so on the Friday morning, I got up at 2 a.m. again, preparing to be witty and charming, and expecting a beautiful pixie panel party, but it was the Spanish Inquisition, and I wasn't expecting a Spanish Inquisition. And on the panel there was a scientist, a psychiatrist, and a Southern fundamentalist Christian. And the psychiatrist said that I was clearly delusional or having a psychotic episode. The fundamentalist Christian, she said that I was trafficking with the devil, and that the Satan's minions come to seduce me and lead me directly to hell. And the scientist said, well, there's absolutely no scientific proof of fairies. They're all wives' tale and hoo-ha, and that I was probably a weed-smoking, mushroom-munching, new age hippie nincompoop. Well,
Wow, that's a bit harsh, Lindy.
Oh my God.
but, you know,
Yeah.
I stayed really calm under fire. I argued my point, and they hammered me, and I argued my point some more, but I stayed calm. I was very pleased with how I stayed calm. And when it had finished, I got off the phone, and I just had this seething lava pit inside me that was just spitting and popping. And I thought, you know, I had my opinion, I defended it, I was right, they were wrong. And then I went to bed trying to soothe my lava pit, thinking, you know, I'm so magnanimous and compassionate that I really empathized for them and their shallow, narrow-minded minds. And as I was lying in bed, knowing that I was right and they were wrong, all of a sudden a story popped into my head. And this is a story from India. Long, long ago, in a beautiful valley that ran along a river, under a palm tree, there sat 6 men. And this morning, they'd fallen to arguing. You see, they always like to compare who was the wisest and who had the most knowledge. But all of them had been blind since birth. But every day they would sit under their palm tree and discuss the ways of the world, and they would argue their points. Now this day they were arguing about an elephant. For none had ever seen an elephant. They all knew the stories about elephants, and sometimes it was gentle, and sometimes it was crazed and wild, and sometimes it was intelligent, and sometimes it was just a rampaging monster, and nobody really understood the truth of the elephant. So they decided to find out the truth, and they hired a young guide to take them. And the young guide turned up in the morning, and the first blind man put his hand on his shoulders. The next blind man put his hand on his shoulders, and one by one they formed a bit of a conga line, and they made their way through the forest. And they walked all morning, and they arrived to a clearing about lunchtime, and there stood an enormous bull elephant. It had been working all morning, and now it had been stopped for its lunch break, its handler sitting nearby. None of the blind men, of course, could see the elephant, so the young guide positioned them one by one around the beast. And then they all reached up and began to touch the elephant. And the first man standing beside the elephant reached up and touched its enormous side, and he said, "Oh, my brothers, this is the truth as I know it. Of course, the elephant is like a hard-baked mud wall, baked hard in the sun. Yes, such is the truth of the elephant." And then the second one yelled out, "No, my brother, what are you talking about? No, the elephant is smooth and long and, pointy like a spear. Such is the truth of the elephant." And then the third one called out, "Oh, you are mistaken. You are terribly mistaken. Why, no, the elephant is, it's thin like a rope and it smells quite offensive." And the fourth one said, "Oh, brothers, you know nothing. Of course, the elephant is like a snake, a large, powerful snake. Oh, it is most definitely serpentine in appearance." And then the next one said, no, why, even a blind man could tell that the elephant is like a huge cooling fan, said the one that was standing under the ear. And then the last one spoke out, "Oh, my brothers, you are all quite mad, because I know that this elephant is round and sturdy like a pillar. Why, it's like a giant palm tree." And then, each convinced of his own truth of the elephant, they once again linked linked their bodies and made their way back to the forest. And when they got to their village, they sat again under their tree and began to argue. Such is the truth. This is not the truth. Such is the truth. No, that is not the truth. This is the truth. Each had his own experience of the elephant, and each was convinced that he was right. I thought I was right. I knew I was right. I'm sure that my story was the right story about the fairies. And then I realised, maybe I just was holding really tightly to my part of the elephant. Maybe everybody on the panel had a different part of the elephant, and none of us had been willing to listen to the other one's experience of their story or their experience or their part of the elephant. So maybe none of us could get a picture of what an elephant really looked like. And so ever since that night, whenever I'm having an argument, and I do have arguments with my husband and other people, whenever I'm having an argument, whenever I'm feeling the need to defend my opinion, my truth, my story, whenever I'm feeling that I'm right and everyone else is wrong, and whenever that lava pit inside me starts to spit and pop, then that elephant pops into my head and I think, oh, maybe I'm just holding too tightly to my piece of the elephant. Maybe we're all just holding a different piece of the elephant. And then I think, well, if I listen, if we all listen, then maybe we'll become able to consider and understand what the whole elephant looks like. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was so good, Lindy. That was amazing.
That was great.
Back to Karen.
The elephant in the room is so good. It's so
I
good.
love the elephant in the room.
Can anyone see it? It's like no one can see it, you guys. You're all blind. You're all blind, you idiots. It's just a perception. Some people talk to fairies, and that's not necessarily crazy, all right? Some people talk to animals too. We're all a little crazy.
Yeah. So, look, Lindy, thank you. And I guess that, you know, I love story for a start. I love story. I love taking it back to that place of myth and legend and fable and the collective unconscious and everything that connects us as human beings, because a lot of what separates us as human beings is what we're speaking about today. And that's the biomedical model of mental health, which has a tendency to separate us from ourselves and separate us from each other. I mean, and obviously that's my version of the truth, and there are many others who just go, no, you're a mad fool, Karen. This works really well. But it is the importance of actually listening to each other and coming up with different perspectives, and attempting to come up with better solutions than what we have now, because what we're talking about now is about the consequences of really firmly held beliefs about the truth and reality, that have their consequences, really. And some of the consequences when it comes to diagnoses and medications in the mental health system are tragic, tragic. And obviously good things happen, but the tragedy far outweighs that, really. And so I think the best place to go to now is to David Carmichael. Is that okay with you, David?
I'm flexible. Whatever works for you will work.
Oh, well, good, because in my mind I haven't figured out how to link the Chromecast watching of the docker, the mini YouTube thing that we put together, that Tim's in, that you're in, that Bob Whitaker's in, etc.
Yeah.
I haven't figured out how to do that so that everyone else can see it just yet. So if you're happy to speak about your experience as per the big picture of what we're doing today, that would be a wonderful thing.
Okay. Well, first of all, the elephant story was I interpret that a bit differently. First, now I'm totally confused about what elephants really are. But, I've always talked about my role in all this is to deal with the elephant in the room of our healthcare system, which is the pharmaceutical industry. And that's sort of where I focused for the since 2006. And I do have to acknowledge Australia because I was involved in a mental health and crisis lecture tour there in 2018. But more recently on your real life current affairs show, there's probably the best interview I've ever done, which was aired last November in Australia on Channel 7 and then put online. And the producer who interviewed me was probably the most informative host or interview I've ever had. He understood SSRI antidepressants, which is really where my story starts. Like many people, I was told I had a chemical imbalance in my brain. And now we know that's a myth. But back in 2003, 2004, most people took the drugs because they thought it was going to cure a biological problem. In my case, it drove me through akathisia, drove me into emotional blunting, drove me into psychosis. And I'm sorry, you've got the criminal lawyer who's there with you. She's still sitting there in the chair beside you?
Yep.
The criminal lawyer?
Hello.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, you know what? Because criminal defense lawyer was a critical part of my survival because I took the life of my 11-year-old son in 2004, was charged with first-degree murder, was judged to be not criminally responsible or insane, depending on what terminology used in what country, but the drug was never brought into the discussion. In my case, there was no question for both our Crown attorney's expert forensic psychiatrist, and I think you use Crown attorney in Australia, right? Use Crown attorney?
They do, yeah. Well, Crown prosecutor.
Okay, Crown prosecutor.
Legal aid would be the defender.
In my defense lawyer, yeah, there was a joint resolution that I was psychotic, but now the issue is what caused my psychosis. And was it the drug or was it a biological condition? And I had a lawsuit against GlaxoSmithKline that lasted a decade where, I wasn't treating what they would have considered to be psychotic depression with medication therapy or anything. And we never got to trial. It got dismissed on a statute of limitations argument. But to me, increasingly, as I stay away from all of these psychiatric drugs that are supposed to balance out your chemicals, I'm healthier, and I've dealt with way more stress since 2004. And when I went public in 2006, than I've ever dealt with in my life. We've got a different perspective on it. I spent a lot of time speaking out publicly on some pretty high profile shows. Probably the most recent is a BBC Panorama film about James Holmes, who's the Aurora theater shooter. There's a segment of me in that where my calm, organized behavior, which is reflective of many mass shooters, is sort of where I'm headed now. And I'm heading to the US to do a series of public forums on mass shootings and SSRI antidepressants to try to drive the narrative away from just gun control laws. So in a nutshell, that's my story without getting into detail. It's, if you go to knowyourdrugs.org, which is something that, I'm managing now. It's part of a charitable organization in Canada. You can read more of it if you're interested, but I've definitely had an extreme reaction, became psychotic, had several delusions or 5 delusions. And as a result, we lost our wonderful son and we've had to try to rebuild from it. And my daughter is still right by my side all the way. She's been on, a few of the shows with me and in a film. So, and to me, what's been wonderful in this, is my daughter's, without me asking her to step up and say, Dad, I want to be with you on these shows. So, including the Dr. Oz show in the United States. We've she's dealt with a lot of, interview anxiety, now she's working in the US and doing well.
Yeah, that's great.
And my wife's still with me, which surprised a lot of people, including a current affairs show here, that my wife has stood by my side as well the whole time. She knew it was a drug. There was no question about it.
I think this looks like there's a lot more evidence today to certainly support what you're saying, that's for sure. But just going back to your comment about the trial, the trouble with the criminal justice system is that it focuses very narrowly on issues, and the issue of what caused the psychosis is very rarely at issue in a criminal trial. It's whether it's present or not. Full stop. End
Yeah.
of story. So no one's going to dig deep and go, why is that so? And so the criminal.
Well, and then we had some of the evidence by the time my kids got to trial because the warnings were coming out. But it was interesting because my lawyer told me that even if we could prove, which is very hard to prove causality, everything after clinical trials is considered post-marketing experience. It's all anecdotal. It is just bizarre. The only time they'll acknowledge causality is if they have it through clinical trial data.
Well,
Which,
mental illness. So I guess that's the problem, isn't it? If we start talking about causality, we're really going into a morass of.
Well, yeah, but I think in my case, what was interesting was my lawyer, my criminal lawyer. We had enough. We could have argued it at the time, but he said even if I was successful at proving or getting a jury to be convinced that it was Paxil that caused my psychosis, or you call it, is it Aeropax in Australia? I'm not sure where everybody. So, even if we're successful, the best I could expect is a manslaughter conviction. Because we're in the same categories as alcohol and illicit drugs. There's just nothing in the system in most countries that gives us any type of defense to prescription drugs.
No.
Yet. But I do believe it's coming. You're starting to see judges a little more open-minded. So at least in North America, you are. So, I mean, I'm open to questions, comments. I've sort of dealt with a lot of different things. The best question I had, and I forget the gentleman's name from Real Life, the current affairs show, a very interesting question. And I'll end on this. At the very end, first time I've ever been asked, would Ian be proud? That was the name of my son. I hope so. I hope so. So there's my executive summary. From my office in my vehicle now, because my wife and I have traveled out to the west coast of Canada, which created even more confusion for Karen, and for me trying to figure out what time to come on, because I was doing a cross Canada tour around prescription drug safety, and we decided to stay out here in the west. So we're living at an RV park. And actually we're quite enjoying it. It takes both of us back to our childhood. So my office is literally in a van. I'm sitting here with my computer and everything on my lap here on a portable desk. So I'm not traveling and stopping. I'm literally in an office. It just doesn't look like all of yours.
I have a question if nobody else does, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the whole campaign about prescription drugs going on at the moment. There is certainly a lot of evidence that prescription drug misuse is causing a hell of a lot of trauma and death. I've just heard of a friend's son who's overdosed on a combination of drugs, but some of them from a doctor. Do you see that as part of your campaign, or are you only focusing very narrowly on the psychiatric drugs? Or are you?
Oh, no. Our website. Okay, so Know Your Drugs is basically, if you remember from Nike, they had a campaign, Just Do It.
Yeah.
And it's a call to action. It's like Know Your Drugs. I was introduced to Paxil by my family, and identical twin brother that told me if it works for me, it works for you. And, there's so many other variables involved. It's so complex. It goes back to the elephant story. I mean, what is right and wrong? I mean, who knows? I mean, my goodness, it's very complex to even think of, that scenario anymore for me. There's different variations on a lot of things. So, in terms of the campaign, Know Your Drugs, it's also a portal. There's nothing original on it. We're linking to good tools so people can do three things: research their own drug side effects. So they may go to a doctor and very quickly you get a prescription. Do your research then, and if you don't want to get your prescription filled, don't. Go back, get another doctor, go back to that doctor with questions from risk.org, rx.org is sort of a collaborator in what I'm doing. The second part of it is, so you're questioning your doctor, then you're researching drug side effects, and then you're reporting adverse drug reactions. Because right now, even though in 2017 homicide was listed ideation as a post-marketing adverse reaction in the FDA's drug label for Paxil, 95% of those reports came from the pharmaceutical companies. 95, and they're mandated to report. People aren't reporting their adverse reactions. So government is sitting there getting all their information from the drug companies and have a vested interest in not reporting, not to mention the fraud with all the clinical trials. So I think people are starting to, go back to your question, I think people are starting to understand some very big issues. And I'll be quite honest, I think COVID has helped. I think as we're starting to see adverse reactions starting to play out in different ways, right, wrong, whatever, who knows what's right, who knows what's fake news. I mean, all I know is there's been people in the mainstream media that have quit because they've been scripted all through COVID.
Yeah.
Just based on principle, they had to leave, the broadcast that they were with. So there's some big issues playing out. My role right now is to focus on SSRIs, but the website, we cover all drugs because it really is about prescription drug safety. Our mandate is to help people make informed choices, Canadians particularly, about prescription drug use, but it's a global awareness campaign. And I've had tremendous support from people in different countries, including Karen. Like it really does take a team effort.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. It's so interesting, if you don't mind me chiming in just about the studies. What I've been wondering about with the drug trials, because I actually interrogated a psychiatric worker recently, and they said, they admitted that there's obviously nothing that you can look at on a scan to see that there's an illness. There's no physical trace of anything. So any illness or any diagnosis is literally just made up by the doctor. And the doctor's job, the doctor doesn't have any other job but to find a diagnosis. Like if you think about a psychiatrist and what they get praised for, it's giving medication, it's giving a diagnosis. They've not trained to do anything else. They're not trained to offer any other experience. And so about these drug trials, I'm kind of curious. There's a gentleman, Derek Perez. He wrote a book about psychedelics, and he did a lot of research into the DSM-5 and the scam DSM-5 and just like psychiatry in general. But where was I going with that? Oh yeah, he was just like talking along the same lines, but talking about how the trials often say that you can do the drugs and then but if they had talk therapy, the drugs worked better. So it's kind of like, all right, well, that's interesting. What about if we just took away the drugs then? Did anyone try doing that? And like, I don't know, just all, and what kind of things were happening in those drug trials? Like, I'd love to be a fly on the wall with the kind of things that they're telling patients, because if there's nothing you can picture on it, like if there's nothing you can diagnose like that's physical and it is just a made up thing, then like, what are the people running the trials telling patients? Like, oh, so are you feeling better then? You must be feeling better now that we've got your medication, right? You know what I mean? And of course, they think they're doing a good job because they're prescribing the medication that they've been educated to believe is the right thing. But of course, that's not necessarily the case. So yeah, I just have so many questions to like go behind the scenes and like find out more about what's really going on in that kind of thing.
And can I just interrupt for 2 seconds, especially taking into account David's story? It's most people who are involved in this world in any way, shape or form echo exactly what you said, but it's that thing of everyone and their dog, pretty much knows this information regarding dodgy trials, dodgy research, vested interests, this is the most open secret in the whole entire world, really. And nothing changes, that's the thing. And that's if we can acknowledge that that's the reality of this situation to a very large extent, and come from perspectives of looking at what sort of ideas we can come up with, and it does link back to the law and criminology as to what needs to change here so that it doesn't remain an endless nightmare.
Can I also say something? I think you also have to think about history, and you also have to think about the concept of sameness and difference. In history, it was only in the 18th century that humanitarianism offered any other treatment for mental illness rather than exclusion. And all tribes have both experimented with altered states of reality, either in terms of mythic things or in terms of self-medication. And in terms of the alternatives, when we talk about sameness and difference, you also have to remember that organisations like workhouses and Bedlam existed, institutions around which people who were perceived to be different were housed. And that was a way of ridding society of what they were seen as disruptive or disorganising elements. And the alternative to that was eugenics, and the Nazis perfected that, and that was undertaken extensively in America as well. We often forget that. But eugenics sterilised women who had a history of any degree of mental illness, and anyone in institutions was euthanised. And that's the polite way of talking about what actually happened.
Oh my God.
Can I just chip in here, because one of the things that we're attempting to do is to come from different perspectives, one of which is the transpersonal perspective, one of which is to do with initiation, and it's the hero's journey. So when Katie speaks about isolation and being separating people from the tribe, from the culture, that's also that thing of what happens with initiation, in that people who are undergoing a rite of passage, are removed from their general society, from their general everyday life, and that happens in different religious orders, in different tribal societies, etc. And if you look at it from that perspective, not only is it a very different process, but it's a very different aim, it's a very different end, so and that's one of the things that we're trying to do here, to introduce that way of viewing these experiences, so that if I'm wigging out and believing that I am the chosen one and Eve, as I once did, very firmly convinced of that, then, and if I was doing that in a context where people went, Karen's having a spiritual crisis, or Karen's, in an alternative reality, or Karen is, any of the other different ways that can become out when we're speaking about Indigenous cultures, when non-Western cultures, where it's just a phase, it's a phase, it's a rite of passage.
Yep.
Happens, it's something that you go through, and the whole idea is that you go through it. And if that was the perspective that we looked at a psychotic state, then there's a very different outcome. It's just seen as a natural response to life. There are people around you who care for and understand what's happening, and if you're Jesus or the chosen one, then good for you. You go for your life, my friend, really. But it's not a matter for ticking off boxes on a DSM that goes schizophrenia, bipolar, and that's that very different path, and whether or not that comes down to David's experience of depression, and this is the horror of this whole system, and especially now in regards to the Moncrief report, where it's out there in the world from psychiatry, and because it's coming from psychiatry, it's far more recognised than if it's coming from me or David or Tim or any of us here, really, because we're not psychiatrists. Hallelujah, praise the Lord, thank you. But because
Karen, if I can just make one comment. What's really interesting is my diagnosis, for the sake of the criminal courts, was major depression with psychotic episodes.
Yeah.
I'm convinced I was never depressed. I was just distressed. I went from stress to distress because of cash flow. Absolutely. And, I've never really, when I've been through Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory, and I've done it a few times, most of my symptoms weren't those of depression. Yep. Most of them, literally within 2 weeks, I had lost a lot of weight. It came on, and the second time was sleep deprivation. To me, sleep deprivation is my absolute biggest trigger. I become a very good power napper.
Sleep. Oh, yes.
I could recline this seat and be asleep in minutes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, all of this, in my view, all of this comes down to this. All of it, and you take into account, what was the trigger for you, your business folded, imagine that happening, millions of times around the world here at the moment because of COVID, people walking in.
Oh, I know. That's why I'm out speaking. That's why I'm out speaking now, touring now, because it was cash flow worries that, and leveraging everything you can until you get nothing more to leverage. That's really what caused taking my stress to distress.
Absolutely.
And, a lot of people Gosh, so many people are experiencing that globally right now.
Absolutely. So you pair that with the knowledge that we now have, as if we didn't have it before, that, you know, the chemical imbalance theory of depression, you know, is, you know, a lie, and that antidepressants, you know, a bit of a placebo, maybe work, maybe don't, etc. You know, you imagine the millions of people, and I mean, we know this, you know, we know this, millions of people around the world on antidepressants, all of a sudden going, what the fuck, you know, really? And then you take into account withdrawals, you know, which are an absolute nightmare and can send you into the weirdest places imaginable, so that you are actually psychotic and etc. So you imagine the nightmare that is unfolding at the moment. If the only answer that we have is diagnose and medicate, you know, but now we know that the diagnosis is dodgy and the medications don't work anyway, you know, fuck, really, isn't it? It's not funny, Karen.
Karen,
Well, there's
I feel like I need to tell my story now, if that's all right.
Yes, do.
Hi, guys. I'm in the UK. My name's Julie. I'm a mental health nurse. I've qualified in 2006. Like the other lady said earlier, I can't remember her name. Just bear with me a minute. In a minute. And I feel really awful saying this. I was one of those people that thought I was doing a really good job, you know, take your medication, and I was talking to them, and I thought, you know, and I'm still doing it now, and I don't really want to carry on doing it, but at the moment I have to support my family. So me and my partner went through something very traumatic. Trauma is the buzzword, trauma here, that I never dealt with properly. I thought I did. I got admitted to hospital in 2013-14 with reactive depression. That was caused by something, reactive depression, something that happened that caused a reaction. And that was a normal reaction. I don't really want to go into it because it's quite personal, but yeah. So I kind of went into the system, got out, kind of got my life back on order and everything like that. Got back to work. In fact, no, I couldn't get back to work for a bit. Trying to piece everything together because it's been so mind-blowing, really. So yeah, I got myself back together. So I managed to get myself in a nursing home with dementia patients, giving them medication for the dementia, you know, awful, really not nice. Anyway, the manager was awful. I got bullied there by someone who I actually did my nurse training with, teached as a student. She was awful, really awful. Anyway, so I needed to leave that job. So anyway, I ended up working in, I currently work in a low medium forensic unit. So there are people that are there on section 3741s. The criminally insane, let's say, they call them. So they've committed a crime because of their mental health. Anyway, I went through a spiritual crisis. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. I got down, got back up again. I got down, back up and down. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't have a clue what was going on. So I went into the system again, out, in, out, in, out. And this carried on for a year and a half. They medicated me. They tried giving me olanzapine, didn't have that, spat that out. You know, it made me fat. Basically, I put on 4 stone. I was like 10 and a half and I went up to 14 and a half stone. Couldn't fit in any of my clothes, slobbing about, dribbling, just wanting to eat, dribbling on my pillow. Oh, it was awful. I just like disconnect. But through the spiritual crisis, I felt connected to everything in the universe. And I mean everything. To the stars, to the moon, to the earth. I felt the pain of the earth. Like Mother Nature was talking to me. I was talking to the animals. I was talking to the trees, the birds, the bees, the butterflies. Like she said earlier, the fairies. I saw things. I saw fairies. I even thought I saw, well, no, I didn't. I did see Mary and Jesus on my decking in a hologram form. Then I saw my nan and granddad's heads. I mean, what was that all about? They were hologram, but they just had the heads there. But it didn't frighten me. It didn't frighten me. And I was telling my story. It's like I was telling my story to Mary. She was quite influential in my spiritual awakening. Mary Magdalene, you know, who got, she was slated by the church for being a prostitute. And then the Catholic Church, then all of a sudden in 2016, all them years later, after they slaughtered all the pagans, decided that she was the apostle of apostles. Well, actually, she was the lady of love. All she wanted to do was look after the children. That's all she wanted to do was the children. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, there's lots of other things that happened. I felt a very demonic presence, like something that, I know something attached itself to me. I could have ended up hurting the person that I love the most in the world, my soulmate. But for some reason, I felt like the devil was in him. It could have gone very horribly wrong when I look at it, because I look at who I'm working with now. Do you know what I mean? But I felt like I needed to protect him because I loved him that much. I wanted this thing out, whatever it was. So then it started all getting very mystical, and I heard the Egyptians, who were very hysterical, actually. They had me in stitches. And throughout my time in hospital, it was very dark and horrible, but the Egyptians played this story out in my head about Horace's high that was going in my nan's apple pie and Yorkshire pudding. And I was on floor in hysterics, looking like a crazy loony woman. But yeah, they kept me out of that, you know, the darkness of the psychiatric unit, you know. Isis, Horus, Ray, Ra, but it's really Ray, the sun, you know. It's all connected, the sun, the moon, the stars, everything, the universe. Anyway, so they put me on medication, lithium, toxic, poison, rat shit, what's in it? Excuse my French. What else was it? Duloxetine, and quetiapine, yeah. So that's why I put on 4.5 stone. So anyway, eventually gets out of the hospital on a CTO, community treatment orders, because if I didn't, you know, comply with it, then they could take me back into hospital and medicate me again. Anyway, so I got home, and then the raging anxiety set in. Raging anxiety. Now come to think of it, your point with the medication, that did cause that anxiety, obviously. Something did. Oh, I couldn't, you know, but I still managed to get myself out, because I knew, because I was a mental health nurse, that I couldn't stay in the out. I needed to get out. So I was like my mum and my family were so supportive, and a lot of people don't get that, but they were so supportive. And my partner was amazing, really amazing. And I sat there, and also I was very drawn to Reiki. So I went to do my Reiki 1, started doing that, feeling a bit better. Then I did my Reiki 2. I started the 21-day healing cleanse, it's called. Started doing that. And then I'd been off work for 1.5 years, and I thought, I've got to get back to work. I don't want to be on benefits. I want to get back to work to do my job, you know. So I started doing the 21-day Reiki, feeling a lot better. And I thought, that's not the medication, because I've been on this medication for a bit. And then I thought, I've got to change my mindset. I've got to think, right, the more I'm taking this medication, it's more I'm reaffirming that I've got bipolar. I'm 40.
Here. Yeah.
I was 45 when I was diagnosed with it, which is very, very extremely rare. No history in my family. And I've got this knowledge because I'm a mental health nurse. And I thought, no, I'm not having this. I have not got bipolar. I went through something. And at the time, I didn't know what it was. And I was trying to figure it all out. So I just stopped my medication straight away, because I'd put on that much weight. I thought, oh yes, titrate. I thought, well, I'm there looking like a fat be, excuse my word, you know. It's all right, you saying titrate it. I don't want to put on no more weight. I'm self-conscious, not fitting my clothes. So I just thought, I just stopped it. I just stopped it completely. And I thought, right, well, either something's going to go terribly wrong or it's not. I didn't know quite which way it'd go. But 2 years later, I'm on no medication. I'm back at work and I'm doing amazing. I'm living my best life and I'm doing Reiki and it keeps me well, spiritually well. In the hospital, right? We don't treat the person we don't treat the spirit of a person. We treat physically, intellectually, emotionally, socially. We miss out the spiritual side. That is what we are missing because people are going through spiritual awakenings left, right, and centre. And I can tell you, guarantee everybody in that hospital is, and they're all locked up and segregated and given medication, and it boils my piss, excuse me. But I'm like, at the moment, I want to get out. I've got plans. And at the moment, I'm actually going to a meeting on Friday to discuss implementing Reiki into the hospital and talking about holistic care and how that I've got to be careful because I can't disrespect the medical model, you know, because the medical model's all sunshine and rainbows. And I can't tell them I'm off my medication because they might think, oh my God, what's she talking about, healing energy? But I've got to keep it all quiet, hush, hush, you know. But I know I've got to get it to those patients to help them to heal. And the only way through healing is through, well, from my experience, is through energy healing, you know, healing from, you can talk to a psychiatrist as much as you want, la, 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 blah, 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 and they go through all the stuff that they, over and over, it's re-traumatizing them all the time. And they come to our ward, we take them off, and they go and do whatever they're doing, and they come back, and they leave us to deal with the person that's been re-traumatized, not telling us anything. So we're just left with them. It's insane. It's just insane.
Can I just interrupt for 2 seconds and thank you, really thank you. It's I know how horrifying it is to remember those times, really. And one of the really important things that today is about is the question that you brought to that group, the Spiritual Crisis Research Network, was how to go about having your bipolar diagnosis reversed, really, you know. I mean, and that's a legal matter, and there are, I mean, I've met, you know, psychologists and doctors and people who've spoken about this where the diagnoses have been reversed, but what is said is that it was a misdiagnosis in the first place, right? And so there's never any admission that your story that you spoke about there with the Egyptian and this and that and spiritual realms and all the rest of it has any validity or reality to it. You know, you're still mad, whatever, but they just made a mistake. Maybe you had schizophrenia instead, something along those lines. You know, that's
I could have been diagnosed with that. I could have been diagnosed with paranoia. I could have been diagnosed with.
Exactly.
At first, they wanted to diagnose me with unstable personality disorder, but I didn't fit that. I didn't.
Exactly.
And I got into a meeting.
Exactly.
They said to me,
round and round and round.
I went into this meeting and they said to me, well, we think you've got, and they add things onto it. It used to be PD, now it's EUPD. I mean, what's that all about? Emotional, unstable personality. I went, what? I said, I don't fit the criteria for that. Have you read my notes? Do you know my history?
Yes.
I haven't got any abuse in my family.
Yes.
Nothing. You know, what are you talking about? And then they said, well, what diagnosis would you like? What?
Right.
What diagnosis would I like?
Right.
Yeah, this is what they said in my
anyone. Take your pick. We've got this whole book of diagnoses that we made up.
Yeah.
Which one do you want?
What would you like?
Yeah, how are you
I can't
behaving?
remember what I said.
Look at your behaviour and decide which one you fit into.
Yeah.
I'll just.
I think I said multiple personalities or something.
I'll just.
Because that's what I felt like. I can't remember what I said, to be honest. And actually, when I went for my discharge meeting, and I tried to explain to the so-called psychiatrist, this told me that I was in remission. Yes. Remission from both bipolar. I'm supposed to be on tablets and I'm supposed to be on them for life.
Yes.
What? How can you be in remission?
I'm just going to bring this back to a different place and try and bring it together. And I was wondering if Stephen could speak about, because Stephen's background is in anthropology, sociology research methods, and we've been speaking about, and also background as an English teacher as well. So you bring in that idea of cultural storytelling, the canon, etc., and stories, just stories, narrative. And but one of the things that this is about is about how quantitative research, rats and stats, creates exactly what you were speaking about, exactly, because all of the doctors, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, anyone that you spoke to in while you were going through your stuff, they had this quantitative, ticking boxes, rats and stats, validity,
Yeah.
and all of the rest of it is nutbag stuff, right? So that's the perspective that they were coming from, and that's what the biomedical model is built on, and why it continues despite your story, my story, Tim's, everyone's really, but it still continues because that's the basis, quantitative research, and we're talking about qualitative research now, and that's Stephen's forte. So Stephen, you go for your life.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I'm listening very attentively to what everybody's saying, and speaking about the biomedical model, and in terms of my own research being very much a qualitative researcher, I suppose I try and look at it as in the broadest context that I can, in terms of how do we actually change something like as powerful and as strong as the medical profession. And don't forget the status that it holds in our society, that we can actually change any direction that it takes, by talking about things like we're talking about now, particularly in terms of people's stories, anecdotal information, all the stuff that we've been listening to. How do we actually get to be able to transform a system that's so entrenched? And let's be honest, most people, when Dave was talking about doing your own research and that sort of thing, if you've been diagnosed as being whatever and you've been given certain medication, then what number of people are actually going to go and question what their medicos have told them? Most people don't, I don't think. Most people have faith in the medical profession to the point that they think, well, the doctor has diagnosed this and therefore I've been prescribed this medication, therefore I'll take it. I just wonder how, even when you get the box of pills and it's got all the details of the medication in it, how many people actually ever read them? I mean, exactly. I wonder about that. So I guess what I'm saying is that, yes, I think from my own perspective, we need to take very much more of a qualitative, individual, anecdotal sort of perspective on things, and particularly in terms of my own experience and research in area of anthropology, looking at how different cultures and different societies deal with particular psychoses, or how we might even describe them, because a lot of societies don't even describe them in those terms. They're just something that person passes through, or is just a stage that someone's going through. What Karen mentioned before about initiation states, that state of liminality where you're no longer part of the current society, you go away and you come back and you're a different character, different person, different personality in that society. So yeah, how do we go about trying to transform that biomedical model and for something more beneficial to the individual? I'll leave it at that.
Can I just add one thing, Stephen? And this is in regard to having spent a lot of time on Twitter lately, really, which is quite terrifying. But you will find no finer researcher than psych survivors. Really, they can talk this stuff from now until the end of time, because what they have had to do, is to save their own life, really, and to be on really solid, firm ground in challenging the diagnoses that they've been given, and all of the reasons that part of the reason that we're having this conversation is because of the internet, and because people who have lived experience, who are psych survivors, have shared information with each other because they've come up against exactly the same brick wall as you're talking about, and that's exactly the same brick wall that exists for pretty much everyone, because as you said, the medical model is just so powerful. It's the rule, it's God, etc. But those people who have survived their psychiatric diagnoses and got the hell out, and they know this stuff from the beginning of they can talk any psychiatrist or psychologist or whatever under the table, because they know, because they've used this information, this research, and swapped it all over the place, to save themselves, really, because they had to. And that's, and then, David speaking about having, the Channel 7 or whatever interview, and having spoken to a producer, who was informed on this front. Yes? David Carmichael?
Yeah, no, you could tell.
Yes.
I mean, I'll summarize the interview this way. We started to do the interview on Skype, and we started up a conversation. He stopped it part way. Then he went and he rented a studio in Toronto. He had to do it on camera. He just felt what we were talking about was too important. And I think it was based, I don't know, I think it was, he had some insight, and often that comes from lived experience. And I think we're getting more and more people with lived experience, so, and going back to Steve's comment, it's so true. I mean, one of our key messages, we had a W5 episode in Canada just before the Australian piece. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to convince people not to blindly trust their doctors. That's fundamentally what it is. And that actual phrase was kept twice within our CTV network. And, and it's really exactly what you described, Steve. I mean, how can you not? All those years of education. And, and the one comment I do make with people talking about this, I asked them, in terms of training and education, I said, do you think the pharmaceutical industry wants people on drugs for life? And they'll say, oh, no, we're just supposed. I said, so how many doctors do you know that have been trained on how to get people off drugs? I don't know one pharmaceutical sales rep that comes in with a protocol of getting people off.
Exactly.
And they really don't know what to say. So, I'm just jabbing at it a little bit, bringing a heinous story to the media because they like that type of sensationalism. In many cases, it's a trade-off for me. It is really difficult at times, obviously, to continue to relive it. As Julie was saying, she just going back to it today. I mean, it's always tough. But, going back to, the Australian piece, yeah, I believe people are starting to speak out more, and some of them are in the media. The stigma, maybe realize so many people suffer from different mental, whatever you want to call them, mental health issues. I'm not calling them, we all have a lot of mental health issues. There's no question about it. So, so that's sort of, sorry?
Sorry, I'm interrupting. Carry on, I'm interrupting.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Julie, sorry, I got to ask a question. Julie, what time is it there?
It's 1:30 in the morning.
Yeah,
I know, but I've been getting up in the middle of the night.
Yeah, well,
I've recently been doing some meditating quite a lot.
Oh, have you? Okay, well, good for you. I was thinking about this as you were talking because anyway,
I've had lots of mini breakthroughs, let's say.
No, I did an interview with someone in Manchester earlier today, so that's why I, and I knew it was getting late for her. So
yeah, it's
I think it was quite late for you. Sorry, I know I've deviated. So here we go. Let's go back to Karen.
And I just wanted to say, in regards to where this conversation is heading, at 11 o'clock, Bob Whitaker is speaking, and Maggie, and who else was in that slot? Can't remember. But I've asked Bob to speak about this from the perspective of duty of care and mandatory reporting, because what's going to happen now, and what is already happening, what is very well and truly happening, but especially in response to the Moncrief report, it's that thing of, not only do members of the public know and are wondering and are questioning about their diagnoses and their medications, en masse, as psychiatric survivors have been doing for a very long time. But now this is just your average Joe Blow who's been diagnosed with depression, which is pretty much not everyone. Stop it, Karen. And where does that place your psychologist, your psychiatrist, your doctor, your mental health worker of any type, when you front up and speak about your depression, your anxiety, your reactions to life stresses? What is that conversation going to be like now if we take into account duty of care and mandatory reporting and informed consent, and that both parties on both sides of the table should know, and certainly anyone working in the mental health system who doesn't know about things that they should know about, really,
Yeah.
then where does that leave responsibility and accountability? And that brings us back to what, the reversal of your diagnosis, being on firm ground, knowing your research, really, because everyone, you got to know your research, because
Yeah, exactly.
you are up against, as Stephen said, one of the most powerful, lobbies or whatever, forces in society. And this comes back to trust to a very large extent. We go along to our doctor because we trust that the information that we're going to be given is going to be correct. Particularly with the Moncrief report, now there's a huge question mark over that, and you can't not know that. If you're working in this area, you can't not know this. It's your business to know this. So where does that leave you as a professional if you don't say, hey, guess what?
Yeah. Honest and open, that's what we're taught.
Yes.
Be honest and open. I feel like I need to tell the patients now.
Yes.
Do I tell them off the record?
Absolutely.
I could say I'm in a good position to reach a lot of people, to open the voices, because that's what about. We lose our power, we lose our voice. We're segregated and medicated and made out to be mentally ill, and we're separated from his families, and it's just traumatizing. But I'm just realizing now, even though I don't want to go back to work, I'm in a really good position to bring outside information in, because I've had conversations with patients off record, what I don't put in my notes. And I've actually one of the patients has talked to me about MK Ultra, mind control.
Yes,
you
we're on
know.
the same page here, Julie.
So I don't agree, I don't disagree. I just say to him, look, I don't know if I said it, I believe he knew that I believed what he was saying, and no, he says nobody else believes me, but you do. And when you're on, it's really calm, everything runs smoothly, because I'm honest and open with the patients. And quite recently, it's quite upsetting to me, because I should be confidential. I'm not going to give any names, but I'm telling you this because I'm being honest and open, because that's what I believe we need to be. So we lost a patient recently. He was my patient, and I was the only person that he had contact with. He didn't have any friends, didn't have any family. He'd been in the system for all his life since he were a child. And he told me about this voice that he heard called Ben. And he was very, and I knew what that was like. And he kept saying to me, it's real. I know. And I kept saying, I know. So what I learned about how to protect myself was to use crystals, was to ask for the archangels, was to ask for protection, put myself in a bubble of light, golden light. So I gave him these things to do, and the voice started decreasing. He started sleeping better. His mood increased. When I first started working with him, have you heard of Beck's depression scale? Oh, yeah, Beck's depression scale. So I started, that was really high when I can't remember the exact numbers, but after working with him for about, I don't know, 5 months or something, his self-esteem come back, his self-confidence. I gave him hope. You know, we started talking about the future, and he didn't have any of that before. Nobody had actually sat down with him and given him that hope, because we all kind of think we're doing the right thing until we actually go through something ourselves, and we can actually empathise with the patients and say, I understand, and I actually do understand, but I couldn't tell him because I've got a duty of care. I couldn't tell him that I'd been in hospital with bipolar and that I heard voices, because it's not professional. We've got boundaries. We can't be we expect them to be honest and open with us, but I can't be honest and open with them. And I've got to go back to work, and I want to tell them all, look, I've had bipolar and I'm back at work. If you can do it, I can do it. We all can do it together as a collective. Do you know what I mean?
And that's where
her story, it's his story, it's her story, it's our story, but we don't get listened to.
Are you waving?
Well, that's.
Were you
waving?
Yeah, sorry, I tried to put up my hand there with a little doodle there. My name's Tim Heffernan, and I work from a lived experience perspective in mental health in Australia, in New South Wales, and I'm here in my private capacity, but I'm also a Deputy Commissioner with the Mental Health Commission here in New South Wales. I just want to pick up there because I think, if we want to transform things, if we want to change things, it does lie, as we're all realising, with ourselves. But often, most powerfully, I think, where we position ourselves so that there can be more options for people at that point where someone's in distress. So at the moment, and for a long time, people have had one pathway in, which has been the medical pathway. So more and more, we're trying to offer other pathways. So through lived experience workforce or peer workforce, if you use that terminology. So for instance, when we're talking about risk and responsibility, we know in suicide prevention, say 90%, 95% of risk assessments are not worth the paper they're written on. You have alternatives to suicide groups, you have hearing voices groups where people are forming relationships and holding the risk within the group and supporting each other from a very equal, a mutual point of view. So rather than that patient-clinician relationship, you have a person-to-person relationship, and then that can build with peer-run services more and more if we can get more of those into places where people can go totally outside of the medical model when they're in distress to stay for a while, in respite places. And it's about building alternatives. I have my favourite sort of thesis around all this is that we're a lot like climate change. We know that the climate is, the Earth's under threat because of the climate, but we're so slow to change because of the power that's held by oil companies and all that. So if you apply that to the mental health situation, you have all of this system which is broken, which is not working, which is being constantly fed by workforces that are no longer relevant or as relevant as they were. And yet there's resistance to this new workforce where people want to look after themselves, the peer workforce. So I often say that the lived experience peer workforce is like the renewable resource that we can have in this in mental health. And a lot of the old workforces are the fossil fuel workforces that we need to get rid of. But it's going to take a bit of time. But we do need to create structures for this to happen. So political structures where we can have a voice at this table with the psychiatrists. In Australia, we have a hard time doing that, but we're working towards it. And I'm hopeful that people will have more choice about where to go, and mental health issues will be more about having a relationship. So the person you're talking who unfortunately passed, Julie, could go to be in a situation where they have more support. Sorry, Karen.
What'd you say, Tim?
Oh, sorry, I thought you,
Tim was just talking about the need for more support and peer support at that. So,
well, it's more options. So, we have, when I came to the system in 1983, initial diagnosis of schizophrenia, then bipolar 1 or manic depression in those times. You had one doorway to go through, and you had one set of knowledge. That was accepted. That we're not going to get rid of that completely, but we have to create other pathways for people, and the lived experience pathway is workforce is really important to me. So if we can get, a proportion of the workforce, say 20% of the workforce in mental health is lived experience everywhere. Well, I think it'd make a difference. People would have different ways to go that are not medical, that are just about, holding time, holding space for people and allowing people to heal if they need to heal. If they don't need to heal, just be themselves.
So
Can I just butt in here? Just in terms of what you're saying, Tim, and Karen's point, she made she used the word business, the business of the medical profession, and it just made me think, well, the medical profession, people, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, they're in the business of diagnosing a particular condition and then prescribing whatever it is that's going to cure, I'll say cure, or deal with that condition. And so in everything that's been talked about, I'm just thinking, what is being done educationally in terms of medical schools around the world to try and trigger this a different way of looking at dealing with people's conditions and all that sort of thing, rather than just perpetuating that same business model. That I'm in a profession where I am expected by the public to diagnose whatever the condition a person comes in about, or to tell them what condition that they have, and then prescribe something that's going to help them improve that condition themselves. I'm just wondering, what is being done? Is there any pressure educationally around the world in tertiary institutions, obviously, trying to change the ways that people are looking at the biomedical model and trying to introduce all the things that we're talking about that need to be introduced?
Yeah. This is something I wanted to do, but then again, I wanted to go into the psychiatrist I've got lots of ideas, but of course on my record on the NHS, my name's there. People had to come and nurse me who I worked with. So of course, if I go in there with having a diagnosis of bipolar, who's going to listen to me if I start going on about energy healing? They'll probably think I'm having another episode.
Which
You know what I mean? This is what we're facing.
I think
Sorry, I was just saying it's unfortunate that they won't listen to you, because it's like, well, who else would you listen to? You're the one that's been on both sides of that experience. You've seen how the treatment is happening, and you can see that the treatment isn't working. And that was your profession, that was your training. So you are literally a witness saying the education of these professionals is all wrong. And that's what I've been studying. I've been looking at the education and what's happening in the programming of these professionals, these doctors, that stops them from seeing the problems. Because we have to think about, here we all are sharing these same experiences of trauma and hurt and suffering at the hands of these doctors and the medications that they add on top of it, people. And can I just say, I think it's so outrageous that I've heard these stories of people being on upwards of 17 medications, and who in their right mind thinks that, if the first 7 medications aren't working, then what we should probably do is add another 8 on top of it. You know what I mean? As if that's the right way to go about anything. And that was actually the study I was doing. I got myself sent into the mental health care system, actually. Do you mind if I tell my story, or am I interrupting anyone? I don't want to take the space from anyone if I am.
Can I just say,
yes.
And this is only for the thing of timing, because it's about 10 to 11. Bob Whittaker, or 20 to 11, something like that. Bob Whittaker, who is, I guess the main driving force behind this, both making this clear, this treatment of the mental illness and how the system works and the history and all of the rest of it, from an activist perspective, from an perspective, from a coming from a scientific perspective and then having discovered what the research actually shows. He's going to be speaking at 11, and we're going to be looking at because he's a central figure in this. Really, he's a central figure in the amount of work that he's done in this area, the amount of research, the impact that he's actually had. And your story, can we add that on afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to hear his.
Yeah, absolutely, because it is that thing of the elephant for a start. We all have our different bits. And he's got a pretty serious bit, which sounds weird as, but anyway.
Karen, I just wanted to address Steve's question just about going into the professions, because we are doing it. So, we regularly talk to mental health nursing students, social workers, we talk to psychologists. We've talked to psychiatrists, not in training, but about our Hearing Voices groups. We've had a group I run that's been running for over 10 years. But it's a bit ad hoc, and it's not as organised as it should be, and it's not embedded in curriculum as it should be. So these are the steps we have to take. And I think, Julie, you are an expert by experience, and in the right context and in the right, the right place in terms of you feeling safe, etc. And your story would be most powerful, in terms of being able to change things, I'm sure.
Really?
Yeah.
I would say one thing, just my very brief, my little bit of the elephant is that at the moment, politically, lived experience is the buzzword. And so you are all in a very good position at the moment to affect policy, because bureaucrats are looking around for lived experience people. Every research project I'm on at the moment, they've required a lived experience panel to be involved, and the way we look at it, because I'm working in criminal justice, is that it's really good in the mental health area, because there is an acceptance that lived experience is valid and important in informing policy. To some extent. In criminal justice, as you might expect, it's very different. The stigma is even greater than it is for someone with a mental illness. If you've been in prison and you want to contribute to criminal justice policy, it's like, forget it, you're a criminal. So we're struggling with the same sorts of stigma, I think, and labelling. I think we've been talking about labelling a lot today. And those sticky labels that you just can't get rid of, and transforming them into a strength. But just to give you all some support politically anyway, or certainly in the research and academic field, and in the professional area too, they're really looking for people with lived experience. So I think you are at a very good point now, Julie, and I'd really encourage you to find an outlet for your incredible experience, because working in the system and having experience of it, they are such valuable attributes. And I teach a lot of students like that at the moment. They're just coming through now, though, and it's still really difficult. I'm trying to get a placement.
How do I go about that, though?
Yeah.
How do I go about that? I'm not quite sure where to start.
Linking up with non-government organisations that are working in that field is really probably the best place for you to be protected.
See, I don't know. I don't know all this. This is why I've come, because I only know what I know.
In the UK, there's a couple of wonderful organisations in criminal justice. I'm not so familiar with the mental health stuff, but I'll certainly have a look if I can, Julie, and let Karen know.
Would you take my email? Karen can give you my email.
You have.
I'll have to get off soon, because I've got to go to bed, because I've got to go to work tomorrow.
It gives you that protection, and they've already got some sort of structure, and you can become part of something. And as Tim was saying, really long established organisations here have had, I think, some really excellent inroads into the way that we view mental health, although, as you say, Tim, it's long and slow, but I really see that as something that has been successful in mental health. We're looking at you with envy, really, because we're just at the very beginning of getting institutions to listen to the people who are actually subject to what goes on.
And there are a lot of people in the UK doing the work, doing that lived experience work. Peter Bullymore, Ron Coleman, Ray Waddington.
Yeah, perhaps Tim could assist Julie a bit with that. That might be better because it's not.
That'd be great. If you can take Karen will give you my email, because this is what I need.
Yeah.
And this is what this is just
I'll
what
just
I
put
need.
my email in the chat, Julie, if you like.
Yes.
I don't know how to use the chat. I'm new to all this. Like,
I'm just going to call time out for like 5 minutes while we breathe, and people can get some food if you so desire. Bring it back here. Bob's going to be coming in at 11, which is like 5-10 minutes away, and you know, carry on. Yep.
Julie, do you mind passing your email on verbally if you don't know how to use the
yeah,
chat?
I know how to do it now. So it's I've got here. So
Oh, fine.
Oh, good.
Yeah. No, I did end up with COVID at one point.
Yeah, you told me.
Yeah. But no, I didn't.
Oh,
So
good.
I was ill for maybe a week, but only really sick for about 2 or 3 days. Did you get COVID?
No, and tell me, I guess part of the reason I'm so with fibromyalgia, I don't know, I don't want to be someone longer. So we're just quiet. Everywhere.
I still, yeah, no, I'm funny. I mean, like around here, I feel safe. It's weird, but even though there was quite a bit of COVID around here.
Yeah, I got a nasty dose. I was down for
Ingrid,
weeks.
have you met Maggie?
No, I don't think we met. I've seen your face though.
Yeah, hi, nice
Hi,
to meet
you
you.
too.
Yeah.
So
With locally?
yeah, so Maggie just lives up around the hill,
Kilkea High.
and she and I met through yoga.
Yeah, that's right.
But Ingrid and I went to primary school together.
Oh no!
I know. We
So-
grew up in the same
and
street.
so
And we
Ingrid,
just recently reconnected.
so Ingrid lives in Woy Woy, and she was incredibly
That's right,
important
you
in
mentioned.
helping me when I first came and knew absolutely no one.
Oh, it really helps.
And in the
doesn't it?
early days of COVID.
Yeah.
Oh,
We
no,
weren't
that's
allowed.
right.
So Ingrid was my walking
It was
partner.
awful. I
and,
moved about 3 weeks before they've had the lockdown. So it was like, I was just going, hi to everyone, and then they were like, stranger. There's a woman at the beach going, and where are you from?
Yeah, I
Well,
know.
I think it was
It's
interesting
the
with COVID
xenophobia.
because, everyone became.
Everyone was scared.
So you've just moved up.
I moved just before the pandemic.
So from Sydney, right?
Well, I've got a place in Sydney still.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Same.
Oh, you're
There
from
you go.
Glen
That's
as
close
well.
as
Okay. Right.
So,
I think we're all kindred spirits around here.
I
I feel
think
like there's like
so.
a million women up here who are like my doppelgangers.
Yeah,
I
We've had
do.
these similar lives.
I do
So
think.
whereabouts in Glen?
In Dargan Street,
Oh, okay.
up the end.
Yeah,
We've
yeah.
still got a little flat.
Yeah.
But to rent it out.
Well, we want to settle. Bloody, it's just like
Yeah, or in Woy or in Glen?
in
In
Woy.
Woy.
We want to sell.
I mean, Ingrid's got a lovely property on the water.
Yeah, just on the bay and near the railway place. It's pretty handy.
I'm Katie.
But you can't
Lavinia.
Nice to
meet you.
here.
That's right.
Do people call you Liv or?
No, I don't want to be
I call me Viv.
in a good way.
Australians are great at shortening names.
Yes, they are.
Yeah, that's
Lavinia is a very English name.
It is.
Oh, I tell you, having built a house before.
So, got here in
Yeah.
Worst experience of my life.
Yeah, right. Well, there is that too. I know.
I hadn't done that with $1 million more.
2005.
We started with the global fund.
So,
That's the shock.
Yeah.
Everything doubled in price.
Yeah, right.
I never want to. It needs renovating, but I'm not renovating it. No way.
Yeah.
Nobody would speak to me. I was like, hi.
Look,
Becoming much more satisfied with what I've
Just
just
like,
got down. You know.
yeah.
And I just, that was really
I'm really, you know.
so limited.
Yeah.
It was
It's a shame.
And
Yeah,
it's like
you would just
it's
sell and rebuy, buy somewhere else. Suppose
well,
that's
this
cost.
place is
So
on
no,
the
I'm the
water,
person.
and
I said,
Well, I think one of the things, I mean, I moved from living in the city to here. And,
You like it,
one of the things about being here is that, and one of the locals said it's like being in an island because of the peninsula. And everyone seems to be much more friendly. So you will, if you're walking along, people will wave and say
Yes.
hello.
Whole house cottage now with trees surrounded by trees. I can walk to the beach. So, you know, you kind of adjust, I think, too, to different situations. And, I don't know. I think it's more happy that it's more about where you're happy, I think. If you're not happy where you are, you have to change it.
Well, I mean, the last
Shift
year,
everything
I was
slightly, and everything else will change too.
Sydney apparently is one of the most friendly places.
Nobody wants to make the effort of me. I thought it would be the opposite for some reason.
It is an outdoor society.
It's chickeny. And I was chickpeas. I thought it was so friendly.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So friendly. Yeah.
So are you
Oh, they bugger.
from around here as well?
Sorry.
or
The ones that
from
travel
Glebe?
out. Yes, possibly. It's like every country. Yes, of course. Yeah. This is only my experience of coming.
So you've been up here for a while?
They're different. But everybody's different out of their comfort zone. So when I've travelled extensively around the world, when you know there's another traveller,
You just arrived back,
and there's
you
no
say,
social
overseas.
Two reasons why I think so, and that was the point I was trying to make a bit earlier about sameness and different. So a lot of it is about love and fear. So love and fear. So people you love and feel connected to, and then I think there's also a biological limit to how many connections you can actually have, and there's a fear of opening up to a stranger because they may harm you or detract in some way, or make demands that you're not without it.
Perspective, yes, because a lot of people that I met, especially women, didn't want any more friends because they've already got friends.
Yes,
So why would I want
So
Imagine limiting the number of friends that you've
but
got.
there is
Sorry.
there's some stuff written about this, and I think a lot of people make their friends in their high school and early years, and then often they pair up, and then it becomes family centric. So again, if you're a woman without a husband or a woman without children, then that does put you on the outer.
It would put me.
Yeah,
I
it's
didn't
really
have
hard.
children, didn't have a
It's
dog.
really hard.
Yeah.
So I was already there.
It's not every level.
And I'm walking around going,
where
oh,
to
I
live,
add to the mix, I'm English, and so I'm
Yeah.
glowing. And I'm just like, okay. See, in Balmain, I blended in because I didn't really have to. Yeah, I stuck out like sore thumb.
I thought I stuck out like gold. Never mind.
It's taken. I've been here since.
I argue with everyone's
And is
husbands,
that-
that's my
is
problem.
that
And then I met
ideal?
their wives, I think, oh, aren't you lovely?
But
And then
single
I
women
realised,
are also dangerous.
I realise they're
because
connected to
they
these horrible things.
destabilise
Yes.
permanent couples.
And they
So
don't like. I mean, I was
No, it's true.
late to marry.
Really?
Yeah.
I was late
Yeah.
to marriage in the.
I agree.
So yes, I understand that, and I'm just like, you know what?
Yeah.
I was very open.
Look,
Girls, your husband's the same.
Yeah.
Marriages, any of them?
Well,
Not my
I mean,
type.
it was.
Thank you very much.
So I
But thinking that I
But you
might
really
want
get that
to-
vibe, did you?
Oh my
Oh, absolutely. It's,
Yeah.
it's a real.
Like,
It's a
and
very
I-
real thing.
I was just like,
unfortunately.
you know what?
For me, it was
Because
a-
my background is
A choice
psychology.
between two evils.
I'm a
and
transpersonal
also
therapist
just
as well, but I
wanting to
also
having
spent
elderly
20 years
relatives
on the TV, so I'm creative.
you
And
know,
I
very
read
all
what
of that.
people
So-
on not realising
Took it.
that
Yeah.
I had
I
that
was pro-vax initially, but
ability
then
to say,
I
okay, and I listened to
mainly because of my experience with
and then, you know, I went through
sort
university,
of breaking
got degrees, blah, blah, blah,
against
blah, but
all
still didn't give me that
medications really,
one
and how
underlying
low that
thing
they are.
that I realised, no, it did give me that underlying thing. Realised that even though having the educations I've had, I've been very privileged to have the education. It gave me the insight outside of that to view the whole thing, because my family all around here. So they walk around
your
here.
head, yes.
We can relate to
I mean,
that.
I guess I
So,
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
All
There's
my
no
professionals
debate
in my
allowed.
life, they all look at it, and I go, you know what, I get that, I can see that, you know, famous Ken Robertson quote, academics use the mind just to kind of get around because they're not connected here. And so I'm like the one in the whole family that I go, this, if you look through this way, or blah, 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 and they'll look at me downstairs, and oh my God, when do I get my wings here, people? I'm 53 now, you can't talk to me like that. You know, it doesn't matter for the... Well, it is, but also it's that acceptance of challenge somebody's life or lens that they look through, because I am this. I'm a professor of... I'm great, wonderful. But I'm just trying to explain or ask you about this. And it's not, I'm not asking for a challenge, I'm just asking for a perspective.
Look, I kind of get it because my specialty, everyone thinks they know everything about. So I get told by people all the time about the thing that I know the most about. No, crime's growing, crime everywhere. It's much worse than it used to be, and I go, well, actually, I'm a criminologist, and it isn't. But do you know what I mean? And I get that every day of my life. Really. People will be sitting around talking about something that I know a lot about, as if it's like just common knowledge. And it's hard because I don't want to sit up on my whole house and go, excuse me, but I'm the expert. But you do need that information sometimes to have a decent... The way crime's discussed is just ridiculous. No one seems to have any idea what's going on, really.
Okay. Is everybody...
So I kind of get that expert
Is everyone...
Do you know any...
Yeah, I get a bit like that too.
Hello. Oh, look, hello, Mr. Whitaker. How are you?
Good, fine, thanks, Karen. How are you? It's good to be here.
Oh, look, I'm very, very happy that you're here. Thank you so much for this. So you've missed a very interesting conversation, but hopefully I'm recording it. Hope to God. Yes, I am. My God, amazing. Thank you. If I'm happy for you to introduce yourself. If you are, I've sent people a little bit of background information about who you are and what you've done and what you continue to do, and it's wonderful, and thank you. But if you'd like to introduce yourself and address the conversation that we had regarding, in part, duty of care, etc.
Sorry, Karen, I'm happy to introduce myself in just a second, but then you said address what? I missed that, I'm sorry.
We had conversation whether or not you were happy to speak about duty of care, informed consent, particularly in light of the...
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and also Julie is here, and she was the one who asked that question about the possibilities of reversing her bipolar diagnosis, and you would have far more background information regarding that than most of us. Yeah,
that's a good question. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Karen. It's nice to be here. I even managed to figure out the time difference.
Very impressive.
14 hours difference. Anyway, I'm here in the United States.
Sorry, Bob.
Nice
Sorry, Bob. I struggle with that too. It's David here.
Yeah, it's nice to see you, David.
I was like an hour behind. I was waiting. So, oh yeah, no, I was.
David and
crazy.
I were in a tour of Australia and New Zealand together. I don't know how many years ago, but that's when we had a chance to be together. Yeah. So my name is Bob Whitaker, and I come at this whole story from the background as a journalist. I was a newspaper reporter for a long time, wrote for magazines. There was a time I was director of publications at Harvard Medical School. And my interest in this really began in 1998 when I was doing a series for the Boston Globe on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. And while I was doing that series, and by the way, I had completely conventional understanding when I was doing that series. So my understanding was that researchers had discovered that chemical imbalances were the cause of mental disorders. Low serotonin was the cause of depression. too much dopamine was the cause of schizophrenia. And so that was the story of these great advances. And then what happened was right at the end of this, when I was doing this series, in which we were reporting that dopamine was the cause, too much dopamine was the cause of schizophrenia. And I'd been told that by like 6, 7 experts. And so everything was set in stone and was going to be published. And just as that was being published, I decided like, boy, I wish I would have read the studies in which they found that schizophrenia was due to much dopamine. So I called up a bunch of the experts and said, hey, can you just tell me where you found that people with schizophrenia had too much dopamine? And here's what they told me. And this is what it was this answer as much as anything that set me off in this whole thing about writing about psychiatry. They said, well, we didn't really find that. It's just a metaphor, because they say the drugs are like insulin for diabetes. And I said, I understand that that's a metaphor, but where did you find that in fact people had too much dopamine? And they repeated, we didn't find that. We just use that metaphor because it lets people know why they should take the drugs. And I thought right then, like, well, why are you allowed to lie to people and say to people they have a brain disorder, some known pathology? Why are you allowed to do that in psychiatry when you would never allow, you wouldn't allow that in, other areas of medicine? So that began really the sense of a long interest in documenting and investigating the difference between the story told to the public about chemical imbalances and the efficacy of drugs and the sense that all these psychiatric diagnoses have been found to be discrete disorders, discrete illnesses, diseases of the brain, and what was really in the scientific literature. Now, the reason I was so interested in that gap is because journalists are supposed to, who's our duty to? Our duty is to the public. It's not to the scientists. Our duty is to be good recorders of the truth, relators of the truth to the public. And it became clear that the media was being used by psychiatry as a guild to tell a false story. So I wrote a book called Mad in America, which was basically a story that about how regularly throughout psychiatric history, those who were doing the treating would tell stories about their treatments that would be experienced differently by those who were getting, quote, treated. So I wrote that book, which was a sort of a history of the mistreatment of the seriously mentally ill. Then I wrote some other books. And then I came back and wrote a book called Anatomy of an Epidemic, which was really looking to see how do drugs affect long-term outcomes. And what you find, and as part of that is, I looked at the chemical imbalance story for antidepressants, and it became, and I traced where it came from. I traced the history of it, and I traced within the scientific literature when it fell apart. So for example, the low serotonin theory of depression really fell apart in 1984. That's when the NIMH said, hey, listen, we've investigated this about whether people with depression have low serotonin. We haven't found it to be true. In 1989, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said, hey, listen, this was a hypothesis. We investigated it and we found it not to be true. And yet it was the American Psychiatric Association continued to tell the public that it was true. Anyway, I wrote that book, Anatomy of an Epidemic. That got a fair amount of attention. And then I started a website called Mad in America. And the purpose of the website of Mad in America is twofold. One, it is to relate to the public what is in the scientific literature. And that includes like daily science reports, because you'll see that the reports in the daily science literature just don't fit with what's being told to the public. And then it's also to highlight alternatives, to provide resources about how the drugs act on the brain, some of the adverse effects, some of the extreme adverse effects. David Carmichael can talk about that. And Mad in America, the website, is really turning into a bit of an international phenomenon. We now have 11 countries, 11 people in 11 countries that have started affiliates. And really the basis of the whole idea of Mad in America is this: to make the real science known, also to invite the voices of those with people with lived experience, so these voices get known, and also have information about alternatives to psych drugs, and what we really know about diagnoses. And what we know about diagnoses is, of course, that they're constructs. They don't reflect diseases in nature. And the larger goal here is this: societies have organized themselves around a false narrative. It's happened in Australia. It's happened all around the world. And by the way, that has changed our sense of self. It's changed how we treat our kids. It's changed how we raise our kids. That false narrative has had a dramatic influence on societies around the world. So our mission really is to make known that that's a false narrative, and then try to be a force for creating a new narrative that is grounded in science and also grounded in humanism and philosophy of being. You know, what does it mean to be alive? What can we expect to be alive? And that's where I'm at. And I will say it's a struggle keeping Mad in America going, but for example, the last 2 months, I think just at our Mad in America site, we've had about 1 million visitors. So that's evidence of how there is a hunger for knowledge, for understanding, and for creating a new paradigm of care. So that's who I am. So, okay. Should I go ahead, Karen, to the informed consent, or should I stop there?
Yeah, because just encapsulating some of what you said, there are many among us, some courtesy of Mad in America, etc. But psych survivors, etc., who have worked out the fallacy of the chemical imbalance theory, for decades, and largely to do with people having needed to do their own research and challenge what they were being told so that they could escape diagnoses and medications, etc. So, as you said in an article that you wrote from Mad in America, regarding the Moncrief report, there's few of us who've worked this out beforehand, but because it's coming out from psychiatry and because it's being pressed, it's timing to a very large extent. But it is that thing of when we look at the reality of the lie that has been told and the consequences of that lie. And for example, my experience of having challenged an ADHD diagnosis of one of the little guys that I was working with and being sacked for that, regardless of sending them, current research that backs up everything that we know to be true in this regard, and knowing that I'm not the only person internationally that this has happened to, it brings it back to duty of care. And part of the conversation that we were speaking that was happened earlier was particularly in regards to the Moncrief report, particularly taking into account that there are millions of people around the world who are on antidepressants who have now discovered that there's no biochemical imbalance in their brain and that the medications are dodgy, and withdrawal impacts and the consequences and the ripple effects that will happen from that. And then taking that back to the conversation that someone who's going through a great deal of stress, brings to a doctor's office, a psychologist's office, a psychiatrist's office, where does that leave that professional if they don't say, hey, this is the correct information in regard to both depression and the medications, from a duty of care, legal perspective, a change perspective, where does that leave them? Because this is about transparency and what we know to be true. This is what we're told to be true and the consequences of that and how long it takes change to happen. It strikes me that this is that point where these conversations need to be had from the perspective of the doctor, the psychologist, the psychiatrist. If they don't know this stuff and if they're not honest about it, if I come in, can I sue? And if not, why not? That's my question.
Yeah, listen, so and I'll explain what I wrote in that article on Mad in America, because I wanted to put this betrayal, and it is a betrayal, and it is actually what was done, at least in the United States, it's a criminal act, because you're not allowed to lie to patients in the United States, okay? You can't tell them that they have a known pathology and the drugs fix that if it's not true. We have informed consent laws. So let me just take us back a second. Let's go to the Moncrief paper real quickly. So the Moncrief paper, which was published maybe almost 2 months ago, in a way didn't provide any new information. Okay, there's been plenty of announcements that the low serotonin theory was long ago debunked. And you even had things like Ronald Pies, the former editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times, saying, none of us ever believed that. It was always a sort of it was a myth propounded. No well-informed psychiatrist ever believed that. It was never propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. Now, the APA as an organization was doing it, but he was saying is, we've known this hasn't been true for a long time. And as I said, in 1999, the APA's own textbook said that the hypothesis is dead. So what Moncrief and Horowitz did and their colleagues is they went through all the different efforts to try to find if low serotonin was a cause of depression. And of course, what you find in 50 years, they didn't find it to be so. And I think one of the reasons their research did get a lot of attention was before you had individuals saying it and individual announcements, we didn't find anything to be true, but somehow the way they summarized all the research, it made a big splash. Now, at the same time, they reported on surveys, they cited surveys that find that 80 to 85% of people in countries around the world, and then particularly in English-speaking countries, now know that low serotonin is a cause of depression. That's what they think. So right away here, you see this extraordinary decades of people being diagnosed and medicated with a lack of informed consent. And not just a lack of informed consent, a lie, okay? Now, in American law, the informed consent principle, of course, comes out of World War II, because you had the Nazis doing experiments on Jewish people without their, quote, consent. I mean, there were all sorts of awful experiments, even before they killed people. And so the principle arose out of those Nazi experiments and the Nuremberg trials, that in research, because Germany was calling these things, the studies they did on Jewish prisoners, studies, that if you do research, you have to get informed consent about the risks of that research from the person that you're recruiting into your research. Okay, so first it was a principle in research. However, then it began to be expanded to ordinary medical care. And in the United States, there was a case, I forget, I wrote about this case, but I don't have the name of it, which said there's a legal obligation for doctors or prescribers or medical professionals to provide patients with informed consent about diagnosis, what's wrong with them, treatment, what are the benefits and risks. And the idea with informed consent is that the patients have the right to self-determination over their own bodies, over their own lives. And without informed consent, you lose that self-determination, okay? And there have been criminal cases against pharmaceutical companies for lying to patients about the merits of their drugs, say like of the antidepressants or the antipsychotics. So that, and they pled guilty to criminal charges for hiding information, say, for example, with olanzapine, and that it could cause diabetes. So the principle is quite clear that a doctor or prescriber has to provide informed consent. And if you lie to the person, that can in fact even be a criminal charge, okay? And in other areas of medicine, if you lie to a patient, you lose your license and you could go to jail. Now, so what I said is that's the legal framework for understanding what is the obligation of a doctor and by extension, a medical profession to the public. Now, clearly, the American Psychiatric Association, having said in 1999 in its own textbook that the low serotonin theory didn't pan out, yet a year later they were saying in the magazine, the head of the APA was saying, we now know that depression is due to low serotonin and our drugs fix that chemical imbalance, like insulin for diabetes, In 2005, they put out a press release saying psychiatrists are experts in fixing chemical imbalances in the brain. Their website announced this for years, and that's why society believed. And that's why millions of people around the world experiencing a bout of depression went to a doctor, whether it be a psychiatrist and a GP, were told they have a chemical imbalance. Now, if you're told you have a biological pathology, you are sort of primed to think, well, then I need a drug for it. And you're told that that drug fixes it, like insulin for diabetes. You're being told you need to take this drug, okay, under a false pretense. And by the way, you're also being told you're very likely going to need it for life because this is seen as a permanent problem, the low serotonin thing. Now, that's the first part. That is a form of, it's not just betrayal, it is an illegal act, okay? Now, the problem here in terms of actually doing a lawsuit is the lie is so big. The lie is so, it's like a whole medical establishment is involved in it. It's really hard to sue a whole medical discipline. You can pick off one doctor, but how do you sue a whole medical discipline? We're just not sort of designed as a society to think of doctors in this way and respond to that in this way. Now, the antidepressant story gets worse. The reason it gets worse is at the same time they were telling the story, they were hiding results from trials in real world people. Forget their clinical trials, which were done by industry funded. And what those trials showed is A, response rates were quite low. Very few people were actually getting well. B, they were suffering all sorts of adverse events, including manic episodes sometimes, that was a risk, including psychotic episodes at times, that was a risk. It became known too that it was hard to come off these drugs. There were a number of long-term studies, and time again, the medicated patients were more likely to still be symptomatic years later compared to those who didn't take the drugs. They were much more likely to go on disability. So even as people around the world were being told they had a chemical imbalance and needed to take the drugs, that wasn't true, but they also had clinical outcomes data that told of drugs that induced changes in the brain that, well, first of all, drugs that could cause these adverse effects. And then the biggest thing was this, that these drugs, rather than fix chemical imbalances, actually induced chemical imbalances. Your brain began operating in a manner that's, quote, qualitatively and quantitatively different than normal. And as early as the 1990s, researchers were saying, we think the drugs are causing a change in the brain that makes people more likely to become chronically depressed. And they called that persistent chronic depression tardive dysphoria. So even as people were being lied to about why they needed to go on an antidepressant, the field was hiding outcomes literature that told of very poor long-term outcomes on the drugs, and in fact, increasing evidence that the drugs induced changes that led to chronic depression. And the largest antidepressant trial ever conducted, which is known as STAR-D trial, now that was funded by the government, by the National Institute of Mental Health, not by pharma, that produced the worst outcomes I've ever seen in any trial for depression. At the end of 1 year, out of 4,000 people who entered the trial, only 108 were well at the end of 1 year. Now, these results were so bad, and they were supposed to guide clinical care, that the researchers didn't make them known. There's a little graphic in there. It took years of sleuthing and freedom of information requests to make this known. They lied about the results of that study. Now, this has been a repetitive pattern in American psychiatry when they do these sort of naturalistic studies of long-term outcomes. The results have been so poor, they've hidden the results. That's for stimulants. Karen said she got sacked related to talking about ADHD. Well, we did in the United States did a long-term study of ADHD, and by 3 years, being on drug was a marker of deterioration, not a marker of benefit. At 6 years, the kids that were on drugs were more likely to have worse ADHD symptoms, functional impairment, and higher delinquency rates. They were all negatives. There was no positive outcome on any domain of functioning, but that wasn't communicated to the public. Instead, what was communicated to the public was that ADHD is a brain disease, which is not true. There's no evidence of any known pathology, and that you can get in trouble if you don't medicate your kid. In the United States, you can be a parent that you may have to fight to keep your parents if you don't medicate them. It can be seen as medical negligence. Anyway, the scope of this story is so grand that lawyers are going to be, it's such a huge betrayal. Lawyers are going to be loath to take it on. They can pick off one miscreant prescriber. It's hard to go after a whole profession. And what has happened with the Moncrief story is it has laid bare the betrayal of populations around the world. You have populations where 20% of the population is on antidepressants, 15, 20%. Think about that. And kids too. This is one of the grossest betrayals of societies that I've ever seen, because it came cloaked as medical knowledge, as medical advances, things we want to believe in. And all the while, it was a lie, a knowing lie. And you can see that it's a knowing lie because you can trace that in the science. And by the way, that's why I stuck with this. I think it's the most damaging lie I've seen in my lifetime. And you have David Carmichael here.
Yes.
David's an example of an extreme victim of this, and his family and his son, because he entered into a form of care where he was told a certain thing was happening and this drug is so effective. Meanwhile, was it fluoxetine you were placed on, David? What were you placed on?
No, paroxetine, Paxil.
Okay.
Paxil.
Well, in those studies, they found plenty of episodes of people who had never had a manic episode before having a manic episode, sometimes even a psychotic episode. Well, and you see that, by the way, as risks that show up in the clinical trial data that is sent to the FDA, but then it's allowed to be hidden. Showed up with fluoxetine.
Can I just interrupt for 2 seconds, Bob?
Yeah.
I was just taking into account that anyone can know this information. Really, it's a matter of choice. If you can Google, anyone can know this, including any member of the medical profession. And taking into account, the extreme long-term nightmare that happens to people's lives generation after generation, taking into account that we now have that cultural shift that has taken us to this place. The question is, what can be done? What can be done differently now than has been done up until now, so that what we know can be utilised in a way that makes it stop. Really, that's the question. And Maggie's here from a criminology perspective, also from a social work perspective. And Dr. Lucia, who isn't here today, she's sick. She's in a court case over all of this matter, and it's that thing of, we know all of this. We know it because we've read the books and we've recovered and we've found out the information that we needed to know. And still, it will be that thing of anyone walking into a doctor's office today, tomorrow, next week, and quite possibly walking out with a diagnosis of anything and medications. And taking into account that we know what we know, what can be done differently so that this new paradigm actually eventuates, rather than it remaining just a dim possibility on the horizon.
I have to go, guys. Sorry to interrupt. I'm going now. Thank you for everything.
All right. Thanks,
Bye.
Power
Julie.
to the
Bye,
people.
Julie.
Bye. Thank you so much for your story.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Yeah, power to the people.
Power to the people.
You got it. You got it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's my question, because Moncrief or no Moncrief, we know this stuff. We know this stuff. Doctors, if they choose to can know this. What will make the change in practice? What will make that change happen?
I think that what will make the change happen, it's got to be a grassroots rebellion. I think as more and more people come to understand this betrayal, they will, they will then seek alternatives, and they'll become a collective voice for change and for a different paradigm. That's the only way I see change. I don't see change coming from the field, from psychiatry as a guild, because as a guild, they're invested in the drugs. That's what they do. They prescribe drugs. If their drugs are seen as worthless, what are they going to do? So the guild's not going to make a change. Plus, they'd have to admit that they basically lied to people for years. Obviously, pharmaceutical companies aren't going to make a change. And I don't think the state's going to make a change. By the state, I mean the government, because the government, in a way, it participated in this whole betrayal.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think the government upholds the system like this. They're all in bed together. My study has been into poverty and where does poverty come from and who creates poverty and why. And from what I can see is that the systems all begin together. And in fact, this is one of the systems that proliferates this system of poverty. And what I've been looking at, I actually put myself into a participant research study of poverty, and I did the same in the mental health care system. Actually, what I did is I actually gaslighted my friends and family, and I was like, look at me, guys, I'm acting so manic, I'm so crazy. And somebody close to me who is
That's brilliant, by the way. Go on.
Of 40 years was like, oh, there's something wrong with you. And I was like, oh no, I feel like you're going to have me sent into rehab. Please don't send me into rehab. And then before you know it, police are showing up my door and taking me into the system. But because it was a participatory study too, it turned into this thing where I was gaslighting the doctors, but then because I was interrogating them and I couldn't break through to them, I couldn't convince them that I was, and I tried to tell them too, I was like, you guys, I'm tricking you. Like I even told them flat out, I was like, I'm actually working on an undercover investigation into corruption and negligence in the mental health care system. And it's all in my medical records. They were like, she says she's working on an undercover investigation into the mental health care. It says that I'm negligent for not looking at her report, wants to replace the inpatient ward with play therapy. Play therapy, like the amount of times that he brought it up, like play therapy was a silly idea. I'm like, doctor, do you even know like what that means? And like, what do you think people who are feeling kind of down need? Like, do they need fun and love and light in their lives, or do they need medication, And so that's what I've been looking at. And it's been my study of the education and the programming that the doctors are under and the whole system is under, because otherwise, how could professionals possibly go about prescribing things that make people like David do terrible things and not take responsibility for that? You know what I mean? Like that is so heartbreaking, David, for you to have had to go through that experience, because these people are so ignorant and they're so up themselves. They think they're so confident because they've got all this like education. And I have this one, I recorded everything, of course. I'm like, I am recording. They're like, says she's recording, says she's a spy. I'm like, you guys, I'm a spy. It's like a tactic, right? Hiding in plain sight, where you just like tell people exactly what you're doing. And they're like, she must be lying, like, because you've already got this lens over them. And like, they just wouldn't budge. And it didn't matter what door I knocked on. I just kept coming up against this same programming. And that's what I've been doing to the person in my life who's close to me. I've been provoking them to see if I can break down this programming. And they'd say to me things like, oh yeah, well, the whole system's gone to shit. Psychiatry's gone to shit. Now all they do is like give you a diagnosis that you don't need and stuff you full of medication. And, even told me stories about his experience working in the system where they kept people in these homes, these hospitals for 50 years. And he's like, oh yeah, they didn't need to be there. Like he told me a story about a guy who didn't speak English. This guy spoke Mandarin, and they're like, oh, he was speaking gibberish. Like really, he was speaking fucking gibberish, and no one bloody bothered to get him a translator, hey? Like, and my this person did a lot of night shifts. I'm like, what, you couldn't have spent any time on your night shifts teaching this person how to speak English so they could answer your questions about whether there was something actually wrong with them? Yes.
Yeah. Can I, sorry, Carrie, can I just make one comment to Bob? You know, Bob, there's nobody else like you in the world. You know,
I don't
in
know
the
if
sense
that's a
of your
good thing or a
ability.
bad thing.
No, it's an amazing thing because you're talking about a revolution. And, I want to ask you where you think that revolution is at. So if you don't mind, Karen, I have a very
Please,
direct
yeah.
question, but
I'm here for the revolution.
yeah, well, you know what I'll tell you, because Bob is capable of understanding the medical research, which is very hard even for doctors to do. Like, it's not that simple. They listen to pharmaceutical sales reps, okay, because they put it in plain language. Bob, you communicate in plain language, your journalism background, your investigative background. There is nobody like you. Whether your family supports us or not, you're leading a revolution right now. And I understand the challenges with Mad in America. Are we at a turning point yet? I'm looking at social movements. Okay, are we at a turning point? How far down is the tipping point? Like, are we going to see it? When are we going to see? Like, where are we at? And to me, I'm trying to remain as eternally optimistic as possible. I have a very specific role in this, very specific role, to share a story that the mainstream media wants because it's heinous. And it gets me into those opportunities because of the extreme nature of it. And I'm hoping, and that's helped with very little budget to be able to, I can't pay for the type of advertising I brought to just the issue of, SSRIs, and I'll continue to try to do it as much as possible. But we need your Mad in America revolution. How far along are we, Bob? Like, when, like, I'm really curious because I used to look at all, movements, and there's a turning point and a tipping point. Like, what are we talking about, a decade or two, or what does your gut tell you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just real quick, I want to say one thing to Cass. Do you know Nellie Bly by any chance?
Yes, I read the story. Yeah. It might have actually been on one of your websites. Yeah.
Okay. And the insane plate, the David Rosenhan experiment?
No.
Well, and then I'm going to get to David. This was an experiment by a psychologist in the 1970s where he sent ordinary people into mental hospitals. They would present themselves, psychology students, and they would say they were hearing a voice like thud or something. And then what happened was, at some point they said, oh, we're not really mental patients. We're just doing an experiment. Well, the doctors wouldn't believe them. But the funny thing was, right from the beginning, the doctors would say, oh, you're schizophrenic or whatever, because you're this voice. But the other patients said, oh, come on, you're not really crazy. You're faking it.
Right.
The patients actually had better understanding. So anyway, what you're doing is really interesting. Now to David, where are we with this revolution? On the one hand, there is a lot of progress. And by this, I say, I can remember in Mad in America in 2002, I wrote about, the chemical imbalance story being nonsense with schizophrenia. Well, I got hammered for that. You know what I mean? It was a heresy, blah, blah, blah. And now, so you have people admitting that that's not true. That's a big thing because that was the foundation, chemical imbalances, for the whole expansion of the psychiatric enterprise, because that was a story of great advance. So that's collapsed. If you look in the research literature, the whole genetics effort has collapsed. Nasser Ghani, who's a pretty famous guy, just published a paper saying there's no evidence these drugs improve long-term outcome. We shouldn't be using them long-term. They don't fix anything. We should be using them short-term and as low dose as possible. So what you are seeing is within the research literature itself, there is a complete collapse of the story that we were told and that fueled this whole incredible expansion with kids and with everybody, right? So that story has completely collapsed in the research literature, which says to you, when things collapse, that opens up the possibility of a real paradigm shift, right? Or a real sort of something, a revolution to take place. That's my optimistic part. And the fact that people are admitting there's no evidence that drugs, antipsychotics improve long-term outcomes. They're even admitting that now. Well, that would have been complete heresy 10 years ago. And, I've been in places where I thought the psychiatrists were going to burn me at the stake for saying that, here's the evidence. So that's good. We have more and more voices of people saying they want a different way of being, that this disease model is, it's just so, it's such a impoverished philosophy of being, this idea that you're supposed to be sort of mildly interested in life all the time. You're not supposed to suffer. You're not supposed to have ups and downs. Kids aren't supposed to struggle as they grow up. I think people are realizing that's such an impoverished level of being. We also realize we human beings are responsive to environments. So you mentioned poverty. Well, if you have shitty environments, excuse the language, people are not going to do well. Now, we have a lot of shitty environments in the United States, whether it be childcare, certain school settings, inequality, all sorts of, we have increasing poverty among children, that sort of thing. So we have a lot of shitty environments, and everything tells you that if you have shitty environments, it's going to make people miserable. It's going to be hard for people. So there's so much change, David, where that disease model that we're sort of robots of our molecules, that's collapsing. That's number one. It's collapsed in the research literature. Two, there's a hunger and a sense like, hey, that's not how people are. And there is a sense, I think, that like, no, people respond to environments. We need places to be. Kids struggle, blah, blah, blah. Third, there are stories like yours, David, that tell of horrific. There's an increasing volume of horrific stories out there. And you'll see like books by younger people now appearing in the United States where they got medicated when they're 15 and they spent 20 years on the drugs and their life went to shit. And now they're angry and they feel betrayed. And those books are getting published now by mainstream publishers. So in a way, David, you think we are at a tipping point. The problem is, at the same time, there's so much, we don't really exist in democracies anymore, right? I mean, in terms of how governments are run and how states are run. Like in the United States, clearly the power resides in the rich, right? And it doesn't really reside with the people, so to speak. And medical specialties are sort of part of that power structure because they have academic medical centers, there's the money that flows to them, there's prestige that flows to them. So my pessimism comes from that there is a power structure here around this way of treating people, of medicating kids, of medicating adults. But one of the things it does, this form of care, this form of thinking, it puts all the blame for misery in the individual, right? It's your brain that's the problem. It's not that the society is organized in a crappy manner. So if in order to have the revolution, we have to say we have to create new societies, that we have to have societies that try not to have kids in poverty, that try to put focus on schools, good jobs, sort of improving social functioning. Well, that doesn't really fit with the way we have our society structured economically, and in medicine is right now, medicine is 20% of our gross national product in the United States. So in a way, our current thing fits this paradigm of using huge medical resources, right? You make more people sick with this stuff. So I don't see a revolution happening just within the psychiatric field. The question is, can we have this grassroots thing saying, we need a different society. We need a different way we raise our kids. We need a different way when women give birth, what sort of support they have, that sort of thing. So I think we're at a tipping point, but there's a lot of structural powers that resist, that are benefiting from the way things are, that resist giving up that power. And I think the other problem is you'd have to have a whole medical discipline that would have to say like, hey, we screwed up
So
for 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
for 50 years.
taking all of that into account, and one of the things that we've asked Katie to speak about is looking at what's happened in the past, in history. And we had the Richmond report here in Australia, which was about closing down the psych hospitals and putting people into the community. And the report itself, the recommendations itself, wonderful, wonderful stuff. And it's looking at the unforeseen consequences of how that actually panned out. So if we look at ourselves as a similar, good for you, Ricky, look at ourselves at a similar point in history now, at a turning point, at a possible turning point, how not to repeat the mistakes of the past. And Katie comes from interesting perspectives, and this is about coming from interesting, different perspectives. So do you want to say something, Katie?
Yeah, so I'm more than happy to talk about my experience. And, I graduated as an occupational therapist in 1981, and then I was working in the field that was then known around developmental disability. So developmental disability was at a cusp of change at that time. So historically, people who had children that were labelled as developmentally disabled or retarded, again, language has changed, developmentally disabled, but the stigma hasn't. And at that time, doctors told family members to institutionalise those children, and because it was perceived as problematic for the nuclear family, for productivity, and those children were seen as not being of high value. So when I first graduated, I was working with those families and those children, and I was working in an institution. It was the largest in the Southern Hemisphere for people with Down syndrome at that time. So, and I was involved in the beginning of the deinstitutionalisation movement, and in looking at how those people could actually have useful lives and in fact live happily in the community. So I was at the forefront of group homes and the development of group homes, and of training people to actually move into the community. So when the Richmond report came along, I was asked to represent the Occupational Therapy Association, and in the discussions with that. And amongst my peers and colleagues and families, there was a lot of hope about what was going to happen in that regard. However, what I witnessed happen post the deinstitutionalisation was that the money didn't follow. They were going to sell the institutions, they were going to fund adequate care. What I actually saw happen, and my progression as a community therapist after I left the institution and worked at Redfern Newtown community health centres, was that we had increasing homelessness, there was continued stigma, and there was a lack of funding for social housing. So when we think about care and we think about wellness, obviously one of the things that is critical to that is the environment. So the environment is social, physical, and cultural. Now, we've heard a little bit about the social and cultural and the issues with that, whether it's nuclear family, whether it's the economics of poverty, or whether it's sameness and difference. But when we're talking about physical environments, the first most important is to actually have a safe place. And a safe place for most people is a home. So a home is, and obviously homes exist on a continuum, from a bush humpy through to a mansion. And there are issues with each of those different types of housing in terms of security and in terms of what that home affords people. One way I often talk about it with people is that humans are a bit like mollusks, in that we live in an environment which causes, problems for people that have soft skin, lightning strikes, rain, thunder. The environment isn't always nurturing, and in fact we need a hard carapace to actually protect us, and that's what a house does. So when we start to think about housing and home, often that is thought about in terms of units, and to giving housing to units of needy people. And in fact we've been very, very poor at actually providing dwellings that are fit for purpose, or providing dwellings which actually are adjustable or adaptable, and which deal with the issues around instability and mental struggle. And I guess one of the first things that I'd want to say about that is that one way that we've provided housing traditionally has been to provide housing and care as a package. So charitable organisations have often done that, institutions have done that. But the first thing we need to do when we think about the environment and mental health is to decouple care and housing. Why is that so important? It's critical because if in fact your carer is also providing your safe carapace, then in fact you're doubly vulnerable. Because if something goes wrong with the care, then you lose your accommodation as well. So it's really, really important to decouple housing and care, and to have different organisations providing that housing and care. The second important thing is to think about what the housing provides. So traditionally in architecture, and I have a background in architecture, I have been an academic in architecture for nearly 20 years. And when we're thinking about the principles of good design, we're thinking about things like in 1975, Hildebrand talked about Frank Lloyd Wright's work in terms of prospect and refuge. So prospect, we think about towers, we think about being able to safely see across a landscape in order to determine risk. And when we think about refuge, we think about caves, we think about safe, warm spaces, we think about beds and nests. And when we're thinking about design for wellness and for mental health, we have to start to think about that, and we have to articulate that in detail. The devil is in the detail. So again, when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about aspects like territoriality. How do we manage crossing other people's spaces? Is that shared communal parking? Is that shared corridors? Is that a shared lift space? How do we manage that for people who may have psychosis or aggression, or have other issues? We also have to think about that in terms of safety. So when we're talking about safety, often that in mental health design is around security, locking people in. But you don't want chicken runs for humans. So how do you do that in a way which provides prospect and refuge? So one of the things that you might do for people who are at risk of killing themselves, for instance, is you make sure they can't jump off balconies or off windows. You also think about ligature points so that people can't hang themselves. This is a standard design in jails, for instance. But again, often this is not properly considered, and that's what I meant by devil in the detail. And again, if you're deciding a family space and you're thinking about territoriality, how do you manage that? How do you manage, so one of the designs in Australia that has been very successful, particularly with mentally ill homeless men, has been the Winteringham housing design. So one of the principles of that is that everybody has their own front door. And again, that you're not having to cross other people's space to actually enter your own front door. And again, that good design can actually achieve that.
Can I just interrupt for 2 seconds and bring this back to the idea of design? Because what happens in the mental health system to a very large extent is a result of design. You know, the mental health system, you know, you have an entry point and then things happen to you afterwards in the system. Under the guise of care, and so, you know, bringing this idea back to what can be put into place to take advantage of the changes that we are aware of, courtesy of Moncrief, Bob, etc., that can solidify something that's going to be of more use. You know, what can be in place. I mean, and there's already the open paradigm, was it
Universal?
no
Dialogue.
open dialogue. You know, so these things are already in place in society, really, and have been designed by collaborations between psychiatrists and lived experience and ordinary people, etc., etc. And that's a lot about providing a safe place for someone to go through stuff, you know, and come out the other side rather than be diagnosed and spend the rest of their lives in the mental health system. So taking into account that
Can
there
I
are a
just
lot
use
of us,
a word that hasn't been used today that is
Do.
actually really relevant? The word is asylum.
yes, absolutely.
Asylum to me means a safe space where you can go and get better. And I think the
That's
really
open dialogue.
traditional meaning of that word asylum is perhaps what we need to be looking at. And I think I also was around in the deinstitutionalisation policy in the 80s in Australia, and I worked in the prison system, and of course that's where everyone ended up, in prison. From one institution to another, a lot of people who didn't have the coping skills to live. But the idea, I just wanted to put that in. I don't want to take the stage, but I just thought it was good. I hadn't heard anyone mention that word asylum, and I've always thought that the pure meaning of that word is what we really need to recapture.
I mean, that was part of the history that you went into with whichever book it was that, you know, looked at the early Quakers, you know, and how they dealt with madness and eccentricity, etc. And that was it, you know, and it was that notion of separating someone from an environment that was harmful to them and putting them into a safe place and being cocooned to a certain extent and made well. And that's been replaced by the biomedical, you know, diagnose and drug, you know. So I look at this as coming full circle again, and how that can happen, how that can happen, really. That's
I think with New South, hi Bob, Tim Heffernan. I think we are, you know, the idea of asylum and safe places and safe havens and things like that are very important. And in New South Wales, courtesy of the lived experience workforce, the peer workforce, we're starting to build those places. And a lot of that's in the space of suicide prevention, which wants to be a bit separate from mental health. But you know, the same thing applies to mental health, is that, and you know, it's a wicked problem, this revolution, because we have, you know, we're stuck in systems, and I'm stuck in one. You know, I was in hospital in 1983, 1985 when the Richmond Report and all that was happening and deinstitutionalisation was happening. But, you know, we're stuck, and a lot of people are stuck in systems where all the care occurs, acute care, community, coercive treatment under CTAs, mental health acts, etc., where we've been taking medication for all our lives, you know, and the consequences of trying to come off that sometimes can be pretty hard. You know, I tried to come off my lithium, and gradually, and still, you know, despite, and I don't know, you know, being on a half dose for 4 years, having a couple of relapses around COVID time. So it's really complicated what's going to cause all this to happen. But currently, you know, I'll give you an example at the moment. A friend of mine went in, we tried to get through his mania in his home in the community, but he ended up presenting to ED, being admitted to the high dependency unit, which is a tiny little ward, horrible, like it's just horrible. And he got worse and worse. His mania just got worse and worse because he was resisting that. He ended up becoming dehydrated. His sodiums went up. So he's now spent 2 weeks in an ICU ward, you know, to try and get all that fixed and the black bowel obstruction, and is in a place now, like it's just, these environments are so bad. So with the revolution, I do think the lived experience workforce is part of that, is an important part of the revolution, even though some of us are working within the system, some are trying to create alternatives to the system. I think they're both important. And it's just about increasing and tipping that workforce so that we can start to influence, but at the same time build political structures with lived experience leading that, like in Australia, where next week we're having discussions about a national consumer organisation that will be able to have a voice that will perhaps rival our we've got 2 psychiatrists who just constantly turn to for opinion in the media about everything, you know. So like it's a gradual thing, but it's a combination of that really out there social justice movement where people are totally separate and angry and out with their signs in the street, which would be great, but also people are trying to change things from within, I think is really important, you know, to do that as well.
I mean, you can see instances of where, you know, grassroots peer-led movements are having a big impact. You know, creation of respite houses. I mean, Hearing Voices is basically a peer-led movement, and that's had incredible impact at a, you know, an international scale. So this is what I in terms of, and almost going back to David too, that's an example really of a grassroots rebellion, you know, and a grassroots movement when you're talking about people who've with lived experience saying we want to do it differently, and here's what we, you know, here's what we need, here's what we want, and you know, and getting some power too, getting some authority. So yeah, I think these are signs of hope when you see, you know, people with lived experience becoming forces for change and for creating new systems. I also like the word asylum, by the way. It's exactly what it means. It means a sort of place of safety. It's like it's a refuge from danger. So you know, and people need such refuges time to time.
As an academic, some of the things that I've done some work on is that I have shown that environment and housing in particular can reduce care by 42%. And that makes a huge difference in how people relate to each other, and those relationships are what determines what can and can't be tolerated in the society.
Yeah. Listen, I don't know how you're well if you don't have decent housing. I mean, I'd be a mess if I were homeless for 5 days. So, I mean,
yeah, I think that environment
housing is such an obvious example of an environmental solution. You know what I mean? An environmental.
When you look at the homelessness literature, you know, it's a chicken and an egg, as in people become homeless because they have mental health, and then people on the street have mental health issues because they're homeless. So unless you stop the revolving door, and unless society is prepared to provide housing, there's been a number of studies around the world around housing and homelessness where it's actually cheaper for the government to provide free housing than it is to provide the mental health care services that homelessness and crime, etc.
Right.
You know, and yet governments still won't do it, and that's conclusive, like as in it's conclusively cheaper. But that's part of the issue about the physical, social and cultural aspect, because the culture has to and the economics has to actually agree.
I agree.
Can I just you probably have to go to your next exciting bit of your life, Bob. I don't know. But I just,
the next part of my life is going to bed, actually.
That's right. It's nighttime.
Tired.
Maggie?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed hearing all of your wisdom today. I have an academic background in social work and law, but I'm kind of one of those people who doesn't fit in a box. And so I've got a lot of different bits of the elephant that I hang on to. I really loved that story, and I think having storytelling is one of those amazing things that are so good for our mental health, is to hear other people's stories and bits that we can relate to and bits that we can't and so on. It really, and someone who tells a story as well as Lindy does is just a gem on the planet, in my opinion. We need more of them. But look, I come at it from a very different point of view, I suppose, than most, because a bit of both, really, because I've had some personal experience too. But I certainly was around at the early days of the Richmond report, and the hope that we had that putting people in the community and being able to put support around them would be a way of helping people get through distressing times in their lives. But I also just wanted to recount a story of my own as a young social work student walking into Rozelle Hospital for the first time. And noticing the physical disabilities that most of the people in there had. And I asked one of the young residents why I didn't realise that mental illness had so many physical characteristics. And he said, no, that's the medication. And of course, that sent me down the rabbit hole of looking at iatrogenic medicine, which is really an area of study that we probably should all be very familiar with. Iatrogenic meaning causing harm, really, which goes right against the oath that they're supposed to take, a Hippocratic oath and so on, not to cause harm. But I do want to say that I do think that there is some hope in the medical profession, and I don't think we should alienate them, they can alienate us, but I don't think we should demonise them to the extent that they are seen as one thing. They are not one thing. There are radical therapists, there are radical psychiatrists, just as many of them as there is anything else. They do a lot of training. One of my best friends was the head forensic psychiatrist for Victoria until recently. And he knows that handing out drugs to the clients that he had to deal with that man who I won't name, who shot all those people in Tasmania many years ago. And of course, giving a guy like that medication, he's enormously fat now and no better than he was when he first committed those terrible offences. And so I think you'll find that a vast majority of psychiatrists know that what they're doing isn't helping their patients. They're not stupid people. They've got very high ATARs, most of them. Of course, there is that institute, and I think we need to separate that from the institutions. And yes, we're talking about this huge, and I think the drug companies are the institutions that we really are grappling with at the moment. I think the doctors are probably smaller. They are a very powerful group, no doubt. Certainly in Australia, the medical model reigns supreme. I teach social workers at the moment, and one of my main areas when I teach mental health to them is not to see yourself as the handmaiden to the psychiatrist, because you're not. And also for lawyers too, and Tim would have seen that in the mental health tribunal, that sometimes some of the lawyers who represent people can see themselves as part of the treatment team as such, and not an advocate for the person themselves, and that's very complex as well. But anywhere where you've got a situation where people can be forced to do something, whether it's taking medication or to remain in a certain place, then you have to have incredibly strong human rights protections. And I think that's where we really need to be working with the medical profession much more closely about that, because I think they have an interest in that too. And I think that if we demonise them and alienate them, that's not going to help our cause at all. We really it needs to be a hearts and minds campaign, in my opinion. Look, I just wanted to go back, because I have lots of different bits of the elephant. Something that we talked about a bit is legal stuff too. And so I just wanted to pick up from what Robert was saying about duty of care and so on. We have a very different legal system in Australia. It's not as easy to sue people. You could see that as a good thing or a bad thing, but it is very difficult to sue someone. It's very difficult to also get up a medical negligence claim. Really expensive, it costs a fortune. So we have created alternative ways of dealing with it. They're not great, but our complaint systems, and I do think that people don't use them enough. I've been through the healthcare complaint system, and I'll talk about that's another bit of the elephant that I'll mention briefly myself, and so I know it's not perfect. But I do think that we need to use the systems that are presented to us and modify them to that. And I think there is a lot of people in those complaint systems who want to see more people with lived experience, giving their experience to them. If we think of it purely in terms of a legal response, we're going to be very disappointed, because the legal system, in my view as a lawyer, it's a very poor way of dealing with most things. It should always be a last resort, because it's not really going to get you anywhere, and it'll cost you a fortune. And the only people who'll make get anywhere on it are the lawyers, who get a lot of crap for that, but that's their job. So we need to think about other ways that we can work within the system, I think, to change rather than that. And I think that doctors, yes, they have a sciencey perspective. They have a very they don't think about qualitative evidence, for example. They want numbers, they want figures, they want everything. And I do think that there is also a danger in this area of too much hyperbole. And I do say that advisedly, because I'm a very passionate person myself, but I think that if we get carried away with hyperbole about people lying, for example, then we're really getting into dangerous territory here. I think most doctors that I know anyway are ethical human beings who would not lie if they knew they were lying. I think they honestly have believed what they've been taught. Okay, and so I think that my view on it is that if we demonise an entire profession, we're not helping ourselves. What we need to do is identify the ones that have those doubts and give them information and assist them, and really get in there in those little corners and those little gaps where someone's starting to question themselves. My friend who's a forensic care psychiatrist, for example, I've been getting into his gaps for years, honestly. He's now left the system because he cannot work within it anymore. So he wants to work in these areas. But if you start calling him up and saying, well, you're a liar, mate, and you've been lying to your patients all these years, then we're not going to get anywhere. And so I really do think we need much more of a way of getting into the system, as Tim obviously has already and does. And I really admire you for that, Tim, because it must be very difficult. And I think that the nurse who was here before also, I really admire people who can do that. It must be hard to be working in a system that you know didn't help you, but you're then doing it to others. So look, just briefly.
I'm going to have to run here, but real quickly on this.
Yeah.
I agree with you that you don't want to demonize the individuals. I'm not trying to demonize the individuals. There's a lot of psychiatrists I know are great people. They were betrayed by their own guild, though. In other words, they got the message, which then they communicated to the public, which really was a false message. So I'm not demonizing the individuals, and I agree. And I think many psychiatrists feel betrayed by their own guild. But we did have an American guild that lied. They did. And they promoted an understanding, and they, not the drug companies, have the legitimacy. That's who we look for to the truth. So
I absolutely agree with you there. That's the thing. The legitimacy is what we can hold them to account.
Yeah. So I'm not blaming individual doctors. I actually think that the individual doctors can feel betrayed as well, because they didn't have a guild that was informing them. There's many doctors, I'm quite sure, if they told their patients they had a chemical imbalance, they thought it was true.
Yeah, that's right.
Because
That's right. I
also
think they honestly believed it. That's right.
Yeah.
As a criminal lawyer, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about intent. I'm thinking about what people's honest belief was. That's what.
Yeah, it's not at the prescriber level that I think is the problem. The problem is at a guild level, at an institutional level, that decided to tell this story to benefit the guild. Now that's not the individual members, but it's 100% clear that the guild had one understanding in its scientific literature and promoted a different understanding to the public.
Yeah, look,
and
I absolutely take your point there, that those institutions are certainly culpable.
So the American Psychiatric Association, as a guild, as a trade organization, they lied to us. And it's really easy to document. Now, I understand that there's different, so I don't think you should sue individual doctors, okay? That's not the point. But I will say that in the United States, we had a case called the Osheroff case, which was adopted by the biological guys to kill psychotherapy in the United States in 1996. What happened was there was a person named Osheroff who was treated at the Chestnut Lodge with psychotherapy, and he didn't do well. And therefore, he sued that lodge saying, I should have been treated with antidepressants. Now, at that time, in essence, the American Psychiatric Association backed the lawsuit against the psychotherapist because they said, yes, antidepressants are fixed and known biology. So they use, and that law case, one, made actually doctors a little bit vulnerable if they didn't prescribe antidepressants, because that was seen as the standard of care. So I don't want to see individual doctors sued, but the problem is can we have something, at least in the United States, some sort of legal action that requires people to give, starting with the guilt, to give people informed consent? I just think people have that right to be informed about the risks and what is known. And right now, I don't know another lever to force the institution to start being honest. And the other thing again is there's been a number of NIMH studies, which were the outcomes. NIMH is the National Institute of Mental Health. That's our big funder of research, of government research, where the outcomes were poor, really poor. And parents would want to know this. I'd want to know this about an antidepressant, that sort of thing. But they weren't promoted by the Guild, unlike the American Psychiatric Association, or even the NIMH website, because it went against this sort of prevailing narrative.
But that's a problem with
So-
research generally. People always want to have research that's going to back up their ideas, aren't they? And so I think
Yes,
that's a problem with
But,
research
but,
generally.
but again, I feel a duty to the public. And I feel if that the public pays for some research that shows that this is sort of an outcome, they deserve to know that research. That's my fight. And then they can decide whether or not they want to take drugs or whatever. That's their whole, that's the thing. But they deserve informed consent, and parents deserve informed consent around drugs for kids, for example. So I agree with you. I don't want to sue individual doctors. I know very many great individual doctors, but I think they were betrayed too. Anyway, that's my feeling, is that
I'm not arguing against that, but I guess what I am saying is that informed consent and well-structured research can actually be quite difficult. A good example is housing, because what are you going to do? Are you going to take two people that are on the street, give one person a housing, keep the other person on the street? That's actually unethical. So
listen, you don't need research to say that housing is good for people.
Okay, and I think another
you don't need to run a clinical trial to say housing is helpful.
Yeah, well, I think housing is a no-brainer as being helpful personally.
Yeah, you don't need to,
but I think the other thing to remember is that there are other modalities that have proven to be very problematic. And I don't know if many people remember, but in the 1980s in Australia, there was Chelmsford. So Chelmsford caused an enormous amount of trouble. It's a private psychiatric hospital, and they did some very dodgy stuff with sleep therapy. So there are a range of other therapies which are being used in the mental health area, like pithing in America. Rose Kennedy was a person that was subject to that, where, I think we have to be very careful about relative harm and about options for people. And I also think the other thing that is important is, how someone with a mental illness actually impacts other people. Because again, it can be like a system of dominoes. And somebody who refuses to get help, and manic depression as a diagnosis is an absolute classic in this regard, because somebody who's manic is having a lovely time. And, often they're not aware that they're causing distress to other people. And, that can be a real issue. And as you know, in America, the mass killings with guns, that has often been described as having a mental health component. But again, are those people identifying as having a problem and seeking help? By definition, not. So how do you protect society and protect individuals? And again, that comes back to this idea of asylum and informed choice, but also taking into account the wider cultural and social situation.
Can I put a two bobs worth in here to pick up your point about research? I think medical research has been hijacked by the pharmaceutical industry particularly, or by anybody who's going to make a profit from what's discovered. So there's not research. If carrots cured cancer, it'd never be discovered because no one would ever do a trial, right? And if if psychiatry didn't work, that would never be discovered either, because no one would ever do a trial, pretty much. Now, I work in general practice. I think GPs should have to fill in forms about patients who are on various things, and then in 6 months see if they're better or worse. And if they have surgery, they should fill in forms and see if they're better or worse. And in the end, they could say this surgery helped them and this surgeon did good and this one didn't, or this drug made them less depressed and this one didn't. You know, I mean, I think you've got to have somebody completely neutral, and you've got to set up a framework in which to do that. And I think if you're asking how to fix all these ridiculous problems, from cosmetic surgery to drugs that psychiatric drugs that don't actually work, you've got to go to some of the structures there, and you've got to say to the government, look, you've got to fund this stuff, because if you only leave it to the pharmaceuticals to fund it, and I can't remember the name of the guy who said, everyone thinks the FDA approval means something works. That's not true. The FDA only has to show that there's not a net detriment to letting this product become public. Well, what that means is if 50% of the studies show it works and 50% show it doesn't work, and that data hasn't have to be published, they only publish the 50% that show it works, the FDA's approved it, the studies all show that are published show that it works, and bingo, you can market that for 20 or 30 years and make a fortune, and the whole thing's a bloody con. And you could argue that for the whole bloody gamut of the psychiatric drugs, really. I mean, as a GP, I have a lot of depressed patients, and I don't reckon the bloody things work. I haven't done a trial. I'm just saying that my patients don't get any better on them. That's all I'm saying.
No,
Yeah,
I
you've
would
seen that from the
definitely
clinical
support
perception.
that, but then GPs are not supported to prescribe walking or, diet, or to subsidise diet, or to provide, a referral for subsidised physiotherapy.
Well, there's no. I mean,
Sorry, if I can just make a call. I just got a notice my internet connection is unstable. I'm in a forest outside of Victoria, Vancouver Island. If I just drop out of the discussion, nothing personal. Okay, it's the internet connection just went because it is not stable. I'm working on a hotspot here. It's been sort of giving me that notice for a while. So just so you're aware, nothing personal if I'm suddenly vanish.
I think Elena has got a hand up there. I don't know if people have noticed. It's been up for a while.
Sorry, I was listening as well to the conversation, and I wanted to add something, if that's okay. I really agree with approaching this from the both perspective, with the new initiative and approaches within psychiatry and also alternative. And I found an event in January 2021, and it's called Psychosis Studies Meeting. What does psychosis mean in the transdiagnostic era? And he's a lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry by a Dutch professor of psychiatry, Jim van Os. And he basically is saying that psychosis is the capacity to respond with meaning to the environment, environmental changes. And we do not need necessarily brain research to understand psychosis, and that there are many other avenues that help us understand that. So I was just thinking about that idea that generally psychosis is thought to be a neurologic condition. And now new studies within psychiatry and lectures and actually events are demonstrating that actually there are more opportunities to understand psychosis. And also they're saying that they're bringing research about like poor outcomes from this paradigm, and the rising of mortality and lack of progress in psychiatry. And so I was just thinking about these new approaches within the psychiatry field. For example, the beyond the DSM-5, a cross-cultural approach to assessing trauma reactions. And it seems like they also have this way of looking at it through trauma. And I think if we find a common denominator, psychosis and trauma, then that would be a possible link to actually approach that communication between the psychiatry and therapy. I was just wondering if, or like projects or collaborations. And for example, I participated to a conference about hearing voices, and I heard that the psychiatrists there allowed people to have for inpatient, the peer support groups online. So I just wanted to say as well that I feel that there is a bit of hope as well in that. And also the alternative, I live in Ireland, and there is one setting that are, so for example, it's a farm and people are received there for 6 to 1 year to actually recover, but with not the diagnosis. So I just wanted to kind of bring these two perspectives and to see if there is anybody that's heard of these kind of collaborations between
That was the
psychiatry and
David Locke approach.
So
That was the humanitarian 18th century approach, which was the alternative to Bedlam at that time.
And when I first started studying it, people like R.D. Laing, who was an anti-psychiatrist in the 70s, it was all 70s, of course, and we're all hippies and everything, but there was a big, huge movement in the 70s with Ronald Laing, and Thomas Zaz was another one who wrote extensively about the need to allow people to go through their madness. I think Laing did a lot of, he wrote almost ethnographies and descriptions of patients that he'd allowed to, paint with their poo on the walls and all of this. Of course, eventually there was a bit of an evaluation of his work that perhaps some people actually did. And I realised that when I was working with people with mental illness, that people are distressed, and it's very difficult to have the resources and the will and as Katie pointed out, the effect on everybody around them as well has to be taken into account. So those sort of models of dealing with people's distress are very labour intensive, extremely difficult for everybody else to deal with. And of course, a lot of the ideas that those people came up with have been really thrown out. So I guess I'm coming in very quickly to say that I really think we need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater a lot and go, okay, well, this is not working, so we're going to go to this other extreme. We need to take the learnings that we've had from each of these different stages. And I think that, and I know this might be an unpopular thing to say, but I have seen some people respond well to medication. I had a friend who had felt like he had spiders coming out of his ears. It was a drug-induced psychosis that he was experiencing, and it was terribly distressing, and he went through this for months, and he immediately went on antipsychotic medication for a very short period, and it stopped. And so I have seen these drugs work for people. I agree that there's certainly plenty of evidence now that they don't work as they've been represented to work, and that big industries have taken on board, and perhaps pushed them to their financial advantage. But I just wanted to put in a plea for us taking the knowledges from each of these and not being doctrinaire about it. I am evidence-based. I want to see evidence, but as Katie pointed out, sometimes it's very difficult to get evidence about these things. What do you do with, someone's experiencing distress, two people experiencing distress? Do you give one the thing that you think is going to stop it and one not, and let them go through it? So we have really huge ethical difficulties in studying.
I think the thing is about giving, for me, it's about choice, and it's about having choices, and it's about the evidence, like those choices being ones that people are informed about, like Bob said. For me, certainly, as I said, I've been on lithium for 37 years. I'm still here. And as I mentioned, I tried to get off it. But if I have a mania, olanzapine, which is a sedative, is there in the short term, and it helps me sleep, basically. So it knocks me out, and it's there for that purpose. And then it's for a week or so, and then you come off it. It's about when these drugs are prescribed in an acute setting, and then they're there for life because people don't get it, never get it reviewed. They're made to take it. They're given depot medication on top, and I forget who talked about I think it was about the people with physical symptoms. When I came into peer work after working as a teacher for 20 years, we started our Hearing Voices group because people walking around there was terrible going onto a ward and seeing the physical devastation of these drugs. But I'm stuck. This is the wicked thing, lithium, you're told it's the gold standard by psychiatry. I was told it was my chemical imbalances, and that's why I needed it. I haven't the proof, but I know if I try to come off it, it's hard. I intend to come off it because I'm getting old and I don't want to. But I monitor my kidney, I monitor things, but I have, thyroid medication and other stuff. So there are a lot of people who are stuck on medication who it's really hard for them to come off and to be part of the revolution, truly part of it.
Yeah, I do think that.
Listen, everybody, I'm going to have to run just because it's getting quite late here. But I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you all for inviting me. It really was good to listen to people, and it was a good conversation. So I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry, I'm just sort of crashing here. It's like 10:30.
Thanks for coming in, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks very much for having me.
Nice
Really
to meet you,
enjoyed it.
Bob. Bye.
Okay, nice to meet you guys. Bye.
Can I ask you, Bob, before you go, what's the difference between neuroses and psychoses? As a GP who has to certify people crazy and get them carted off by the police, I find the psychoses do respond to the medications, and the neuroses, you'd better off to talk to them. What would you say about that? Is that a reasonable approach?
Yeah.
Listen, I think drugs have a place, okay? And certainly drugs have a place sometimes for psychosis, absolutely. I mean, one of the great things about the Open Dialogue Project is they really figured out a sort of selective use model for psychotic patients. And what they found with the, starting with people who first came in as first episode, there's sort of three groups. They did find, and they would use benzodiazepine sometimes at the beginning. They found that there was a core group of people, I'm talking about first episode psychosis, with sort of intensive social care, right, biological care, right from the beginning, who could get better without going on the antipsychotics. But they would, by the way, prescribe benzos sometimes or sleep agents to help people sleep. Then there was a second group that really didn't seem to get better. And so after a short period of time, they would prescribe an antipsychotic, okay? And they felt that they needed, for stabilization purposes, for interaction purposes, whatever it might be, that could be helpful for a second group. Now, of those that went on the medication, they found that over the long term, some people did better just staying on the medication long term. And some people needed the medication for for only a short period of time, like 6 months. So, and they instituted the selective use model in 1992 in northern Finland. And when they did it this way, 5 years later, they had much superior outcomes to anywhere else in the developed world. And they would not consider that as an anti-med model. They would say it's a best use model in which they found a way to figure out for whom and for how long. And basically they see it with these three different groups, but it does begin with first episode patients trying to see if they could help people get through without exposing them to antipsychotics and sending them down that path. And just as a final word here, and to sort of go to your question or comment, I think the medications have a place. I do. And probably more for psychotic patients than neurotic patients. But what we need is, rather than a one size fits all, we need to see what's the best use models with these drugs as tools as much as anything, and use them in that fashion as tools as opposed to curative agents. So I know plenty of people who have seen the use of antipsychotics as very helpful in acute episodes. And there are some people I know that find them helpful over even a longer period of time. That's great. But it's pretty clear from the research when you see this, that there are long-term recovery rates for psychotic patients are higher for those who eventually get off. That occurs over and over again. Now, that doesn't mean that no one needs them long-term, but just on the whole, you do see greater recovery rates for psychotic patients for those who get off. So you're a doctor. What I'm saying is, to be a good doctor, this sort of nuanced information can really be a help. And it's not anti-medication. It really is nuanced information. And I always thought the idea with medications was you do want to figure out for whom and for how long. And also, if possible, you always wanted to get people down to the lowest dose possible, because we know that, and still have a good outcome. So my problem with the current paradigm of care is it doesn't allow for that nuanced use of medication. It doesn't promote that nuanced use. But clearly, a psychotic patient is in a more difficult state than a neurotic patient.
Yeah, and I think a
Going
lot of
back to
that goes back to the idea that there can be a magic pill that'll fix everything, and that it's cheaper to do that. So there's an economic basis to this as well, which needs to be addressed. But it's very much, I think, not a one-size-fits all, but it's also a really good environmental scan. So, you know, what's happening socially, what's happening culturally, what's happening physically. And only when you understand those variables can you actually make an appropriate assessment for what will work for that person, or what's least best.
I guess I got to run. Thank you very much.
Hey,
I
Bob.
really enjoyed
Thanks,
this.
Bob.
And
Bye.
thanks for inviting me. Ciao, guys. Bye.
Katie, I agree with you there, and that's what I've been studying, the culture and you know, what's happening in our communities, and with all this money that's been invested into this system, into people that go into the system, is it working, or is it costing the government more money? And I'm wondering, Tim, has the government ever done any kind of study into that? Because that's kind of what I've been doing. I'm like, the system is costing more money. Like, I estimate that about upwards of $50,000 was spent on my care. And I can tell you, I went in healthy, acting like I was crazy. And by the time I got out of it, I'd actually forgotten completely about my study. I only just remembered it recently because I was so traumatized by the end of the experience, and they beat it out of me basically. But they spent money into making me sick. Because by the time I left, the doctor told me that I probably wouldn't get another job, even though he didn't look at my resume to see that I had this 15-year career in corporate communications, consulting in global companies around the world, talking with CEOs from all these different industries. Took no time to get to know me or to try to find out more about me. Just made up this story and was like, no, you're sick now. You're going to have to stick on this medication for at least 2 years. You probably won't get a job again. Your report's stupid. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. And for me, it's like that cost that cost our community so much money. I told them I was working on this study. And I was in poverty. I kind of got stuck in poverty, and that was kind of part of the study too. It's like, once you're in that system, you become trapped. Once they get you onto the prescription medication, it does corrupt your body. And I was walking around after the hospital. I was like, I can't move properly. I can't function properly. In fact, when I got out of the hospital, I could barely walk to buy myself groceries. And so what then does that do to my life and the systems that then support me or act like they're supporting me when it certainly seems like all of these people's jobs and administrators' jobs whose time and energy is spent on creating the systems aren't really fixing the problems, are they? They're not going into the drain and fixing them. They're just adding more and more band-aids. So that's my question for you, Tim. Has the government ever looked into this stuff? And do you think there's a responsibility for that to happen?
Yeah, look, I think we're one of the most reported and looked into sectors in Australia, I think. So, you know, you've got obviously the Richmond report. You've got the first national mental health plan in '92. You've got a whole lot of things that have been set in place, but often with systems is that systems have a life of their own, and they're very, and especially systems that are based on acuity and risk, and so everything often defaults back to that thing. And we're also victims of federalisation in that we have our acute care is with the state government, so you've got people where they're responsible for hospitals, they're responsible for, say, community treatment for people with acute or chronic conditions. And then you have the Commonwealth, you have Medicare and primary care and then a whole lot of things now that are coming through PHNs, etc. So the big one was the Productivity Commission's report. But, you know, it's how does that get implemented? There's a Medicare task force at the moment looking at obviously, you know, it's a problem where GPs are so valuable in the mental health system and do the bulk of mental health work, and yet are now having to stop bulk billing, etc., because it's no longer viable to be a GP and bulk bill, and so we're putting people who are poor out of the system. So it is as you know, it's a difficult problem, and so that's why, you know, simply, you know, when I first started peer work, I was running a group on the ward at Wollongong Hospital mental health unit, and on recovery, and this fellow who was a little bit high was saying, everybody come to Tim's group, you know, come to Tim's group, because, you know, my grandmother used to say to me, if you're sick, you don't go to the doctor, you go to someone who's got over the sickness.
Yeah.
So it's really about building that community, and that thing about lived experience is so special, is about how we can come in, infiltrate and change the system, but also create alternative ways of looking after each other outside the system. But ultimately, with mental health, our main focus should be getting people out of the system as quickly as possible and back into jobs, back into good housing, back into meaningful lives, things like that. You know, in New South Wales, our strategic plan, which was driving reform, is called Living Well. We just want people to live. People should be living well. You know, but it defaults back. And Alina, I think you wanted to say something again.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking about what we're talking about, the frame of conceptualizing the experience. So, for example, these experiences of altered state of mind, the way I understand it, some people frame it as in psychosis in the medical system, but then there would be psychosis in the Jungian analytical psychology. For example, a reorganization of the psyche as a healing mechanism to heal itself. And then there will be the transpersonal way of seeing this as a spiritual emergency, for example, the Spiritual Crisis Network in UK. And then I was thinking what I believe is missing from the first intervention in psychosis is actually the understanding of navigating and integrating the experiences. And here I think personally the art therapy or any kind of work through finding a meaning in the experience is very good. For example, I believe that in this kind of altered state of mind, the psyche itself tries to communicate with the person, like certain images, and then that is somehow taken ad literam. And for example, if a person, let's see, perceives the energy of like Mary Magdalene, and that person believes that she is a Mary Magdalene, but then if we look at it from an integration point of view, we see, okay, that person is actually in touch with a certain aspects of himself or herself that represents a certain like archetype from the Mary Magdalene, for example, being I don't know, victimized, and actually that energy is actually about the idea of being empowered. So then what is that metaphor saying about the journey of the person? What is that person going through? So like if we translate all that, what is the image of the psyche trying to say, and what is the journey of the person, and going back to the initial trauma, to developmental trauma. And because I believe that trauma and reenactment of trauma is actually bringing up developmental trauma from the past that wasn't healed. And then it creates a context in a person's present moment that the person thinks, oh, this is happening at this moment. I'm, you know, or the other person is becoming another, like a spiritual being or things like that. But it's just, I think it's just part of the journey. And I believe a lot in the hero journey. And this is a monomyth that it's part of the collective unconscious. So it's ingrained in all of our consciousness. And then each of the time a person goes through like a neurosis or like psychosis or spiritual emergency or any kind of like journey, it's the same journey. It's the journey of going from the consciousness to unconscious and coming back, but coming back changed. And the idea with psychosis, I think the biomedical model works with the idea that a person comes from a certain place and he has to return to the same place, or actually worse, because it becomes diagnosed, it becomes labeled. And then basically the spiritual emergency, I believe that it creates a new opportunity for the person to change its way of being to a higher level of being. And actually that is the like, I feel it's our condition to actually grow. But if we're not offered that opportunity, then we just like, you know, go back. So yeah, so that's why
Yeah,
can
no.
think about this.
Can I thank you for that?
Mm.
Because that's exactly the point that I wanted to come back to. This whole endeavour started from an art therapy and storytelling perspective, and coming from the Jungian perspective, and Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, archetypes, navigation, etc. And the only people that I know who have fully recovered from, psychoses, extreme states, the only ones who have fully recovered and regained their life, at a different footing, are those who have come from that perspective. Really, they may have entered via drugs and biomedical and the system and all of that, but the only people that I know who have fully recovered themselves and their sense of self and their life are those who have discovered and utilized Jung and Campbell and navigational perspectives and cross-cultural perspectives, and the idea of coming through rather than hitting a brick wall and being medicated and diagnosed, and all of that movement is made static. It's made static and it's held in place and it's drugged, and drugs have they have a limited life term or whatever, so your body's going to adapt to whatever drug you're taking at whatever time at some time, and you're going to have to throw in some more, etc., etc. And ultimately all that's being suppressed down and down and down, whether it be trauma, whether it be it doesn't matter what, whatever you're holding down, with drugs or anything else or whatever, is ultimately going to go really. And that's certainly what I've seen in anyone that I've worked with, and anyone that I've spoken to online for decades, really. And the only ones who have come through fully back to who they are and fully back to being human beings are those who have recognized that journey perspective, that process and product perspective, that value of storytelling and being listened to, and the whole context, everything, rather than coming at exactly the same phenomena, whether it be Mary Magdalene or whatever, it doesn't matter. Whether that be seen as a symptom of something wrong with you, or whether it be seen as the psyche writing itself, which is an amazing thing. It gives you gives me, a great deal of respect for what we as human beings are capable of doing, when we have been smashed to pieces and have fallen apart, really. And that's certainly what I've seen as a result of recognizing this as a process that you come through. Doesn't cross-cultural initiation, no initiation is just a walk in the park, really. It's not a lot of fun. But if you come through the other side, you just look back, and you've got that survival thing, and you've got that journey, and you have a totally different perspective. And thank you for reintroducing that, because that was the crux of all of this, really. And it is to do with that thing of when you have fallen apart, when I have fallen apart, if the person that I'm speaking to, it does not have that perspective as an option, as a lens through which to view what's going on for them, then the only option that they have from there on in is the biomedical perspective, is diagnosis, is medication, is however long a period it is that you spend in the mental health system. And quite often that's from now until the day that you die, literally, and that's it. So it comes back to that thing of two pathways, and that pathway is dependent upon who you're speaking to at your most vulnerable and ruined and shattered and all of that. And yes, drugs are good at that point in time. That no one who's been there goes, I can do this by myself. We have modern medicine. Thank you very much. I'll have that for a period of time in my life. Thank you very much. Informed consent, yay, medicine. But after that, then it's that amazing alchemical thing of the psyche healing itself, and that's a fractal thing, that's a and it's an amazing thing once you start to actually contemplate that and look at the fact that people have, throughout history, whether it be indigenous peoples, whether it be shamanic matters, whether it be Jung, whether it be all of those people who are involved in depth psychology, cross-cultural studies, etc., who have actually discovered this stuff. that's amazing. You know, that for me is the amazing discovery side of things. And when you compare that with the discovery of different drugs, you know, that will hold stuff in place and give you a label and give you a very different place in your life from there on in. You know, I just want to shoot people. Sorry, I always get to that point. Sorry.
Okay, Karen, Karen, and everybody else, I'm going to head off.
Oh, thanks, Dave.
Anyway,
Thank
it was
you.
wonderful chatting for a few hours.
Yeah, so great. Thanks
Anyway,
so much for your wisdom,
okay,
David.
anyway,
See you
Have a
at
good-
okay.
Hoover.
Good evening.
I'm voluntarily leaving now. It's not my internet connection. It's held out. So, anyway, thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. And Nina's just arrived, and I thought, anyway, yes, you have just arrived. So would you like to say your bit for 5-10 minutes or something, and then we'll say sayonara? Is that okay?
Yeah, sorry I'm late.
No, that's okay. You made it just in time.
Move the chair closer. Will you walk up to the one now?
No,
Do you want that chair moved closer? Does that work? Close.
So this is Nina Angelo, everyone, who has arrived.
Okay.
Do you want a cup of tea? Want a cup of coffee?
No.
You are such a beagle, aren't you?
Yes.
Such a beagle. I've got one biscuit in here.
Thanks. Oh, really?
Knows it, don't
had
you?
crumb in there, and he still would have got to it.
Nina,
Yes.
have your say, my friend.
True beagle.
Oh, my head's.
She's not
halfway
quite
up the
not landed yet.
No, I'm just trying to land from alchemy through the
okay.
arts.
Yes. So this brings us back to storytelling and education and history.
And the work that I'm doing, yes, with storytelling, working with people's trauma, and their trauma, of course, creates the mental health. And I have been running workshops. Well, I don't even like to call them workshops. I like to call them an event, because I think the workshop is a hard name, where you're working, particularly for women, but not necessarily for women. I call it from a rock to a heart place, because when we go into the story of the hard place that they're coming from, and so we start with childhood stories, because this is where it all begins. When we haven't been affirmed, loved, cared for, heard, listened to as a child, we then suppress all our emotions and we just hold them inside of ourselves. And they just stay there, but they ferment and they get worse and worse. We get on with life, we keep busy, we go out there, we join the gym, we join sports club, we run, we jog, go to the club, go to the pub, do anything to not go to that place. And then when that place starts hurting, we go into medication through our addictions. I just did a From a Rock to a Heart Place workshop on Dangar Island recently. And it's a big thing for the women to come. They know they're coming, and it's often the first time that they've shared that childhood trauma, because when they understand that what we experience as a child when our parent can't give us what we need it's intergenerational. So when a girl child is born, she has every egg in her ovary she's going to need. Every egg is a cell, and every cell has a story, and it carries the memory of the mother, the grandmother, the great-grandmother. So if your parent couldn't give you that love, that affirmation, and feeling loved and held, because they didn't know how, because they never learned that themselves. They never had that in their life. And so what I do, because my intergenerational trauma wasn't through any mental illness, my parents were Holocaust survivors, and they lost everybody. And I was their firstborn in early 47, straight after the war. Thanks. Where I didn't realise, but when I was born in Athens, Greece. My mother was a Polish girl. My father was a Greek man. They met in Auschwitz. She was 16 years younger than my dad. And within, I've just written a memoir, a book about it, I wrote it 3 years ago, but COVID sort of stopped it all. But within that, I had so much love. I was born in Athens, Greece. My mother was going through the trauma of losing everyone, because she lost everyone except an uncle, her brother, my uncle, and her father, who she found after the liberation. And my father the same. He had one brother and one sister. He was from Thessaloniki in Greece. And they were all taken on the cattle trains and they were murdered. Now, I mean my mother, so they fell in love again in the Red Cross canteen in Paris as refugees. And it was quite a big palaver to get for my mum to sort of go over to find her father and go to Greece, where my father had a business. And she was pregnant with me. So I was taking on all her trauma, all her post-traumatic, because there was no counselling, no psychology, no nothing at that stage. So all she had to talk to was my dad. Although she was Polish, my dad was Greek, they spoke French, both of them, and that was our first language. And that was my first language. And then I learned Greek and we spoke Greek at home. So my parents spoke 13 languages between them. Now,
wow.
I took that on. I was in utero when my mother was going through the worst of what she not only experienced as a young adolescent girl on the run, but also, coming through this. Everything was coming through. My dad was the only person that could understand. And that's what I was born into. We came to Australia when I was 2, but I was loved totally. Danced, loved, taken on picnics. We had the United Nations in our home. There were so many languages spoken in there. It was just normal for me. My parents had the numbers on their arms. It only when I started working on my book, because my mum left her story for us. And my dad, I didn't know, he never talked about his time in the camps and as a young man or anything. But by absolute miracle, we found 7 hours of interviews in the Holocaust Museum in Washington in the United States of America.
Wow.
Which I didn't know anything about. That allowed me then to put my mum's story in her words and my dad's story in his words. And so it's in the first person, and then my story, I'm part 2 as a first generation. This brought up in me a stage 4 lymphoma, a blood cancer. And it did that because it's amazing. It's what connects me to my ancestors who all died so tragically. It's the blood. And after I launched the book, I went down with this
environment.
And I had no other choice. So I just trusted and surrendered, questioned it. Why did this happen to me? I've had such a great childhood. Everything that I do is so positive. Why did it happen? But I understand now that it was because I needed to address this. Where did it come from? And then find out that everybody, not just children of the Holocaust and Aboriginal communities, but absolutely everyone has a trauma that they carry in their cells, which manifests in many ways, and they don't know, they suppress it. And so that's why I think I'm still here now, working with, I'm now with women, but I'm very happy to work with men with their childhood stories, holding a rock in their hands, because a rock is like our earth. Our earth holds us, and no matter what mankind does to her, she keeps giving us back. She keeps forgiving, because we get the food and the nourishment and the shelter and everything we need from our mother. And so there's that big word, forgiveness. Without the forgiveness, once we understand where it comes from, we can start the healing. And I take them to the next level after they've shared the stories, holding their rock, catching their tears into the rock. The rock takes all that tears and that story. Then we go into creating through music, blindfolded, getting out of the left side of the brain. I take them through an exercise, that judgmental, critical side that we tell ourselves we're not good enough, because we've heard it as children, a lot of people. We're not good enough, we can't do this, we can't dance, we can't paint, we can't. I take them on this journey into the right side of the brain, the play side. The side where our foot taps when the music's playing and we don't even think about it, it just does it. And once they go into that part of their brain, still blindfolded with music, 5 bits of paper, 40 seconds, 5 types of music. I just let their hands just do whatever they feel with the music. And then they bring in the colour, take the blindfold off. With the colour that they've chosen, they go back over it again, and then they choose a part, a whole bit, whatever, and they paint that onto their rock. And that is their forgiveness rock. And that's the rock that they carry with them. Some of the stories I hear now are so beautiful. Beside their bed, in their pocket, it's there to remind them. So that is how I healed through my art. When I went through my lymphoma, I did 3 works of art. When my ancestors came in one, my bloodlines when I was having the chemo. I've been on the medicinal cannabis oil, the plant medicine, all through my healing. The doctors all knew about it, and I continue every night to take 1 capsule, which I'm sure is what keeps my body going. I have not been vaccinated. I was total vaccine free, and it has protected me. And so I honestly speak so highly of the plant medicine, and I will continue to. So that's sort of my story for now.
Thank you, Nina.
Nina, what kind of capsule would you take? Like psilocybin or cannabis?
It's medicinal cannabis oil.
THC or CBD?
All of it, because without THC, CBD cannot do the work of smashing the cells.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, the balance. You're right.
I've been working with a clinic that's been doing this for 10 years, and they've been working with Newcastle University.
Oh, cool.
The components I've been there, I'm their walking model now. I'm 75, and I've been through all that I've been through since I was 73, 72.
Yeah.
And it's what's been protecting me from everything. So I do plant medicine and getting rid of this spliff, have another spliff, get off your face, all that. That it is the most incredible healing plant. It's a gift.
Oh, I agree with you. Oh, I call it the goddess. She's such a gift. And you missed my story. It's Nina, right? Sorry. Yes. Yeah. I projected myself into the mental health care system by gaslighting my friends and family into thinking that there was something wrong with me. And at the time I was taking some mushrooms every now and again and smoking a lot of cannabis. So it was very easy to act silly. And they're like, you're so manic. And then when the psychological manipulation kind of flipped and they started gaslighting me and I became very, very traumatized, it was actually cannabis that saved my life. I wouldn't have been here without cannabis. It helped me to forget the stories. It helped me to come home to myself, because what I see is that the programs that we pick up from the world around us, from the media, from the things that the doctors tell you when they say there's something wrong with you, as opposed to looking at the environment of a person and saying what's happening in their environment. But cannabis allowed me to forget the brainwashing that they'd put on me to say that I was the one that was bad.
Yes. So if you wouldn't mind if I say thank you very much, and thank you, and thank you, and thank you, and bring this to an end. And if Lindy feels like doing a story to bring this to a storytelling conclusion, really?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, that's
okay.
beautiful.
Good talking to you. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I'm just going to move the cord so I don't strangle the computer. So I just wanted to say that thank you, everybody. It's been very interesting and a great sharing of knowledge. Story for me is, and metaphor are the language of the soul. And I think the soul gets left out of a lot of the health around medicine and mental health. I was in Glastonbury once, and I was just walking past the town hall, and I heard a voice that I recognised. I went in, and it was a storyteller, and she was telling the story of Inanna, the descent of the goddess who goes into the underworld. And it was a very powerful story about Inanna, one of the first stories ever recorded in the world. But she was also telling it as a perspective of her depression and her descent into mental illness. And this is the regular journey that she now takes, but she knows it now, and so she takes this journey, and like Inanna, she asks a friend, a handmaiden, I'm going down into the underworld now, and if I'm not back within so much time, come and find me. And when she's on her journey, there's a really powerful place where Inanna's naked, she's lost everything, and she's nude, and she's hanging on a meat hook on the wall.
Oh no!
And it's so powerful. But this storyteller, she uses that. She'll ring up a friend and say, "Oh look, I'm okay. I'm on the meat hook today. You know, I'll be out in a few days. You know," and it just helps her process her journey. And she knows that she can come out of it. But she also knows she's got her friend, her handmaiden. That if she doesn't, that if she gets stuck on the meat cleaver, that the friend will come down and help her out. So I just, and all fairy tales and myths have a helper, a magical being that's there for you. So nobody has to do this journey alone, and that we all need to reach out and take somebody that we trust to help us along the way. Anyway, thank you everybody. I just want to finish with this short story, another one from India. Vishnu, the god, was sitting up in the heavens, and he was lounging back on his lounge, and he was throwing into the air and catching this beautiful sphere. It was swirling and twirling of all different colours. It was magical to look at. It was the sphere of truth and wisdom. And he lay there and he lifted up and caught it and threw it up and caught it, and the sun would play on all the colours as it swirled and swirled. It was quite hypnotic to watch. And then he threw it up and he dropped it. He dropped it and it fell down through all the worlds. It fell till it crashed onto Earth. And it broke into 1,000,000 pieces, and then the 1,000,000 pieces broke into another 1,000,000 pieces. And people came from running where? There were farmers, there were wives, there were children, there were learned men, there were politicians, there was doctors, there was everybody. And they were running there, picking up a piece of the spear. And all of a sudden, Vishnu just said, "No!" And his yell rent the air, and Hanuman, the god of the monkeys, he came running up and said, "Vishnu, Vishnu, my master, what is the matter? What is the matter?" He said, "I've dropped the spear of truth and wisdom. It's fallen and it's shattered on earth, and the people are gathering pieces." He said, "Well, isn't that a good thing? Now everybody has the truth." And he said, No, you don't understand. Now everybody has a piece of the truth, and nobody has the whole truth. Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you very much, Lindy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindy. That was beautiful. It was such a good metaphor.
Recorded, we'll work out something to do with it if anyone wants to review. So thank you for coming, and I think it's been
Thank you, Karen.
lovely.
Thank you,
Thanks, Tim. Bye.
Thanks, Tim.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, everyone. So great to meet you.
Bye.
Bye, Karen.
Bye.
What an interesting day, Karen.